My name is Charlotte Miller. I am 22 years old. 10 days ago, I stood on the graduation stage at my university in Delaware, holding my valedictorian plaque. My father walked up the stadium steps, took the microphone from my hands, and pointed to a 29-year-old woman sitting in the third row. He told 2,000 people, "I want everyone to meet Vanessa. She is going to be Charlotte Miller's new mother." I didn't cry. I didn't run off the stage. I watched my actual mother drop a bouquet of blue hydrangeas onto the turf. I adjusted my graduation cap, stepped back to the microphone, and read aloud the hotel receipts I had been collecting since my freshman year. Every date, every room number at the Rehoboth Beach Luxury Suites. Before I tell you the look on my father's face when I read those receipts over the stadium speakers, take a second to like and subscribe to Savage Revenge Stories. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from right now. To understand how we reached that moment on the stage, you have to understand the man who hijacked it. Richard Miller ran a corporate logistics empire. In a state where 60% of the Fortune 500 companies hide their assets, my father treated his family like just another shell corporation. Everything was about optics. He despised the fact that I chose to stay in state to study corporate compliance. My older brother Bradley went Ivy League for investment banking. That was the Miller standard. I was just the disappointment who preferred the flat coastal marshes of the Delmarva Peninsula over Manhattan. Graduation day was thick with humidity. The air smelled like the nearby Delaware River. My mother Helen sat in the front row wearing a tailored navy suit, beaming with pride. She had spent 28 years managing Richard's household, hosting his endless corporate dinners, and turning a blind eye to his late nights at the office. I finished my valedictorian speech. The crowd clapped. I felt a rare sense of accomplishment. Then the heavy thud of dress shoes sounded on the wooden stairs behind me. Richard did not wait for the dean to hand me my diploma. He stepped to the podium, his tailored jacket unbuttoned. He gave the crowd his practiced charismatic smile. He tapped the microphone. "Thank you, everyone," he said, his voice echoing across the green turf. "Charlotte has always been a quiet girl, but today she brings our family together. And speaking of family, I would like to take this moment to introduce the future of mine." He gestured to the third row. A woman with an expensive blowout stood up. She wore a white sundress that looked more appropriate for a bridal shower than a university commencement. "This is Vanessa," Richard announced. "We will be getting married this fall." A collective gasp rippled through the tight-knit local crowd. These people knew my mother. They attended the same charity galas and ate blue crabs at the same summer festivals. I looked down at Helen. The color left her face. Her hands went slack. The blue hydrangeas she had bought for me slipped from her fingers and hit the ground with a soft thud. Richard stood there, basking in the shock value, enjoying the cruel theater of discarding a woman who had given him 3 decades of her life. He thought I would lower my head and walk away. He thought I was just the quiet local girl. I stepped forward. I did not shove him. I simply reached out and took the microphone from his hand. I reached into the pocket of my graduation gown and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. I leaned into the mic. My voice rang out crisp and clear. Since we are sharing family milestones, I have a few announcements of my own. June 14th, 2021. The oceanfront suite at Rehoboth Beach. 2 nights billed to the corporate logistics card. Total cost $3,200. Richard froze. A dark flush crept up his neck. I continued reading. October 9th, 2022. The Dewey Beach Villas. A week-long stay disguised as a vendor conference. $7,000. "Charlotte, stop," Richard hissed, reaching for the paper. I stepped out of his reach. I kept reading. I had 14 different dates, 14 different charges. The crowd sat in stunned silence. Vanessa sank back into her folding chair, hiding her face behind a pair of oversized sunglasses. When I finished the list, I folded the paper, placed it back in my pocket, and looked at my father. "Happy graduation, Dad." The silence held for exactly 3 seconds before the whispers erupted. I walked down the stadium steps, linked my arm through my mother's arm, and guided her toward the parking lot. The public spectacle was over. But Richard Miller was not a man who accepted humiliation. As we reached my beat-up Honda, I heard his footsteps pounding on the asphalt behind us. He did not come to apologize. He came to destroy us. Richard caught up to us just as I unlocked the doors to my battered Honda Civic. The asphalt of the university parking lot radiated the stifling afternoon heat, but the air between my father and me felt like winter. He did not run. A man obsessed with optics never runs. He strode with a terrifying, measured pace, his jaw set, his designer suit jacket flapping slightly in the humid breeze. He stepped directly into the path of the driver's side door, forcing me to halt. He did not look at me. Instead, he locked his gaze onto my mother. Helen stood paralyzed by the passenger door, her knuckles white as she gripped the roof of the car. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire reality dissolve into dust. "You have 24 hours," Richard said. His voice was a flat, hollow command that carried no trace of the man she had loved for nearly 3 decades. "Tomorrow at noon, the locks on the Wilmington house will be changed. The security team has already been notified. If you try to take anything other than your clothes, I will have you arrested for theft." My mother opened her mouth, but only a ragged breath escaped. She had spent 28 years ironing those tailored suits, managing his social calendar, and smiling at his corporate galas. She had built the foundation of his logistics empire with her own unpaid labor. Now she was being evicted like a troublesome tenant. I stepped between them. I looked up at the man who shared my last name. "You do not get to threaten her," I said. My tone matched his clinical and devoid of fear. Richard finally looked down at me. His eyes were devoid of anything resembling paternal affection. "You think you won today, Charlotte. You think reading a few hotel receipts makes you a strategist." He let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. "You just severed your only lifeline. You are no longer my daughter. I do not want to see your face near my property, my business, or my new family." He leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of the nearby river. "Good luck navigating the real world with your little local degree. Let us see how far a state diploma gets you when you have no last name to rely on." He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the sea of graduating students and their celebrating families. I opened the passenger door, gently guided my trembling mother into the seat, and buckled her seatbelt for her. I walked around to the driver's side, slid behind the wheel, and turned the ignition. The old engine sputtered before roaring to life, the weak air conditioning doing little to cut through the oppressive Delaware humidity. We drove away from the university campus in total silence. I steered the Honda onto the highway heading north toward Wilmington. Outside my window, the familiar landscape of the Delmarva Peninsula rolled by. Flat, sprawling coastal marshes stretched out toward the horizon, the tall reeds swaying under the pale afternoon sun. The brackish scent of the bay slipped through the air vents. This terrain was my home. I loved the quiet, unpretentious nature of these tight-knit communities. Richard hated it. He always viewed Delaware as nothing more than a convenient tax shelter, a state where more than 60% of Fortune 500 companies incorporated to shield their assets from prying eyes. He craved the prestige of Manhattan, the towering glass skyscrapers, the Ivy League pedigree. That obsession with status was why he worshipped my older brother Bradley. Bradley had played the game perfectly. He went to a top-tier Ivy League university, secured a high-paying job in investment banking in New York City, and wore the arrogant smirk Richard valued so highly. Bradley received the trust fund, the sports cars, and the endless praise. I chose a different path. I stayed in state to study corporate compliance. Richard viewed my decision as a monumental failure. He called me small-minded. He mocked my lack of ambition at every holiday dinner. Why study the rules when the real money is in making them? He would sneer over a plate of roasted duck. But staying local was my deliberate choice. I did not want to make the rules. I wanted to understand how they were broken. Growing up in the shadow of a corporate logistics CEO, I watched how money moved in the dark. I wanted to know the exact legal mechanisms men like my father used to hide their wealth behind anonymous limited liability companies. Being the disappointment of the family meant I was left alone. and being left alone gave me the quiet space to observe, to study, and to learn his playbook inside and out. The silence inside the car was suffocating. Helen stared blankly out the passenger window at the passing marshland. She was a woman in free fall. She had no career of her own, no independent savings, and no identity outside of being Mrs. Richard Miller. The shock was keeping the tears at bay, but I knew the crash was coming. Suddenly, a harsh buzz vibrated from the center console. My phone screen illuminated. It was a text message from a number I did not have saved in my contacts. I glanced down, while keeping one hand on the steering wheel. The preview displayed a single venomous sentence. "You just ruined your own life, little girl. Vanessa." The 29-year-old mistress was already marking her territory. She had likely watched Richard storm off in the parking lot and felt the need to assert her new dominance. She thought I was just a naive college graduate who threw a temper tantrum on stage. She thought her position was secure because she had secured the wealthy CEO. I did not reply. I locked the screen and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. Engaging with her petty insults would be a waste of energy. The public reveal was over, but the true war had only just begun. I was no longer fighting for pride. I was fighting for our basic survival. We pulled into the winding driveway of the Wilmington estate. The imposing brick facade loomed at the end of the manicured lawn. For 2 decades, this house had been the symbol of our family's success. Now it was a ticking time bomb. We had less than 22 hours left to pack up a lifetime of memories. I parked the car and turned off the engine. Helen did not move. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak front door. "Charlotte," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Where are we going to go?" "I have nothing. He controls the deeds. He controls the trusts. We do not even have a place to sleep tomorrow night." I reached across the console and placed my hand over hers. Her fingers were ice cold. "We are going to go inside," I said firmly. "We are going to pack everything you care about. Your jewelry, your family photos, your clothes. Leave the rest. We do not need his furniture." But the money, she pleaded, a note of rising panic in her throat. "Renting an apartment requires a deposit. I do not know if I can even qualify for a lease." "We will handle the money tonight," I reassured her, projecting a confidence I was desperately trying to manifest. "You are on the joint accounts. As soon as we get inside, I am going to transfer enough funds to cover our living expenses for the next 6 months. We will find a small place in Dover, far away from his social circles. We will regroup. We will be fine." I stepped out of the car and guided her toward the front door. I unlocked it and pushed it open. The grand foyer was immaculate, silent, and suffocatingly perfect. The grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the hallway, counting down our remaining hours. I needed to secure our exit strategy immediately. Before we packed a single suitcase, I guided my mother to the kitchen island and opened my laptop. I navigated to her online banking portal. The plan was simple. Move the joint funds to a new secure account under her name alone, secure a short-term rental, and formulate a legal strategy. I typed in her credentials. The loading screen spun for a brief moment. I anticipated seeing the familiar 6-figure balance that usually padded their shared checking and savings accounts. The screen refreshed, displaying the dashboard. I stared at the numbers. My heart hit my ribs with a heavy, sickening thud. The transition from the shock of the graduation stage to the grim reality of our situation was instantaneous. The public drama had been nothing compared to the quiet, devastating truth glowing on the laptop screen. The numbers on the screen were stark. The joint checking balance read $0.00. The savings account, which held the proceeds from the sale of my grandmother's summer home, mirrored that empty digit. I clicked the transaction history tab. A long column of outbound wire transfers filled the page, all initiated within the last 4 hours. Richard had not merely cut my mother out of his life. He had systematically stripped her of every financial resource she possessed. He moved the funds into obscure holding entities right under our noses. This was not a sudden decision made in the heat of a parking lot argument. This level of rapid asset relocation required planning. Richard had engineered his exit strategy months in advance, waiting for the perfect moment to execute it. My graduation stage confrontation simply gave him the excuse to pull the trigger early. We did not wait for the morning to arrive. We grabbed heavy-duty trash bags from the kitchen pantry and stuffed them with my mother's clothing, her personal documents, and a handful of framed family photographs. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight as we loaded the cramped trunk of my Honda. Helen did not look back at the imposing brick facade of the Wilmington estate. She stared straight ahead, her posture rigid, trapped in a state of profound shock. We drove south toward Dover. The landscape outside the car windows shifted from manicured corporate suburbs to the quiet working-class towns of central Delaware. The sprawling estates dissolved into modest strip malls and vast stretches of dark, sleeping marshland. The sun began to rise over the flat horizon, casting a pale, unforgiving light across the cracked asphalt parking lot of a local diner. We parked the car and walked inside. The diner was a relic of an older Delaware far removed from the towering glass structures of the corporate district. We slid into a worn vinyl booth. The air carried the heavy scent of burnt coffee and frying bacon. A tired waitress in a faded apron set down 2 chipped ceramic mugs and a plate of crispy scrapple. Helen stared at the traditional local dish. She did not pick up her fork. She looked down at her hands. Her gold wedding band still rested on her finger, mocking her with its promise of permanence. The tears finally fell. It was not a loud theatrical weeping. It was the quiet, devastating realization of a woman discovering her entire adulthood had been built on a financial illusion. She had trusted him, and her reward was destitution. I needed to secure a roof over our heads. I pulled out my laptop connected to the unsecured diner network and found a modest short-term apartment rental on the edge of town. The deposit was minimal. I typed in the digits of my personal student debit card. I pressed submit. The screen flashed a harsh red warning. Transaction declined. A sudden chill settled in my stomach. I opened my mobile banking application and logged into my personal student portal. My checking account balance was negative $12. Richard had been a required co-signer on my university accounts when I first enrolled as a teenager. Because his name remained on the paperwork, he possessed the legal authority to withdraw the funds. He had drained my account alongside my mother's accounts. I opened my wallet. We held $34 in crumpled cash. That was our entire combined net worth. I stood up, told Helen I needed to make a quick phone call, and pushed through the heavy diner doors. The early morning air was already thick with oppressive humidity. I dialed the New York number of my older brother. Bradley was a senior analyst at a prominent investment bank in Manhattan. He lived in a glass penthouse overlooking the city skyline and wore bespoke suits that cost more than my tuition. He had always been Richard's prized possession. Bradley was the son who played the corporate game without questioning the moral implications of the rules. I expected a lack of empathy, but I still expected basic familial duty toward our mother. The phone rang 3 times before his crisp, annoyed voice answered. "Charlotte," he said, "I am in the middle of preparing a morning brief. Make it fast." "Bradley, I need you to wire funds to a new account," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Dad drained the joint accounts last night. He emptied my student account as well. Mom has nowhere to sleep tonight. We need money for a rental deposit." A long, heavy silence stretched across the cellular connection. When Bradley finally spoke, his tone was devoid of brotherly concern. It sounded exactly like Richard. "You expected a different outcome, Charlotte. You took a private family matter and broadcast it to 2,000 people. You humiliated a chief executive officer in front of his peers, his investors, and his community." My grip on the phone tightened. "You knew about Vanessa?" I realized the truth hitting me like a physical blow. "You knew he was replacing Mom." Bradley sighed, the sound echoing his deep irritation. "Men like our father have certain arrangements. It is the cost of doing business at his level. Mom lived in a $13 million estate and never had to work a day in her life. She was well compensated for her ignorance. You ruined a delicate transition because you wanted to play the righteous victim. He is leaving her on the street, Bradley," I said, my voice rising over the hum of the passing highway traffic. "She is your mother. She chose to side with you," he replied coldly. I am not jeopardizing my inheritance or my position on his advisory board to fund your rebellion. You wanted to be the smart one, Charlotte. Figure it out yourself. Do not call this number again." The line went dead. I lowered the phone from my ear. The ultimate sibling betrayal finalized our isolation. Bradley was not a victim of Richard's narcissism. He was an active participant in it. He protected his future wealth by sacrificing the woman who raised him. I stood in the humid diner parking lot and took a long, stabilizing breath. Panic was a luxury I could not afford. Richard and Bradley assumed their financial blockade would force us into submission. They believed starving us out would make us crawl back and accept whatever humiliating terms they eventually offered. They thought taking away my money took away my power. But Richard forgot one crucial detail. He spent my entire life telling me that studying corporate compliance at a local state school was a waste of time. He failed to realize that learning the intricate rules of Delaware corporate law taught me exactly how to dismantle the men who exploited those rules. I walked back into the diner and slid into the booth across from my mother. She looked up at me, her eyes red and fearful. "What did Bradley say?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. I reached across the sticky table and took her hand. "We are not asking Bradley for help anymore," I told her. "We are not asking anyone for help. We are going to finish this breakfast. We are going to use our $34 to secure a room at a cheap roadside motel for the week." And then what she asked, the despair evident in her trembling shoulders. I looked out the diner window toward the highway leading back to the towering glass structures of the corporate district. "And then I am going to get a job," I said softly. "I am going to walk into the most elite corporate registry firm in the state, and I am going to get hired. I am going to learn the names, the account numbers, and the hidden ledgers. Dad wants to play corporate warfare. I am going to show him how the game is actually won." The skyline of Wilmington is a strange juxtaposition of towering glass skyscrapers reflecting off the flat, muddy waters of the Christina River. It is a quiet city, lacking the chaotic energy of New York or the historical grandeur of Philadelphia, but it holds a secret that makes it one of the most powerful places on Earth. Delaware is the corporate capital of America. Over 60% of the Fortune 500 companies are incorporated within a few square miles of these streets. They come here for the favorable tax laws, the specialized courts, and above all, the anonymity. This was the world my father worshipped, and it was the world I needed to infiltrate if my mother and I were going to survive. 2 days after Richard drained our accounts, I walked into the marble lobby of Rossi & Associates. It was one of the most prestigious corporate registry and compliance firms in the state. I wore a tailored black skirt and a crisp white blouse. No one looking at me would guess I had washed that blouse in the rusty sink of a roadside motel the night before. I carried my fresh degree in corporate compliance and a resume that highlighted my deep understanding of local statutory frameworks. The managing partner, Evelyn Rossi, conducted the final interview herself. Evelyn was a woman in her late 50s who wore her silver hair in a sharp bob. She scrutinized my resume with dark, assessing eyes. She did not ask about my family, and I did not offer the information. The Miller name was well known in the local logistics sector, but I spun my narrative carefully. I framed myself as an eager, independent professional seeking to build her own reputation outside the shadow of a family business. Evelyn appreciated my direct answers and my lack of entitlement. She offered me an entry-level compliance analyst position. The salary was modest for the industry, but to me it was a lifeline. I accepted immediately. The immediate financial bleeding was patched, but a new, exhausting reality set in. My life split into two drastically different worlds. By day, I navigated the pristine, high-stakes environment of Rossi & Associates. By night, I returned to a dingy motel room off Route 13. Helen spent most of her days sitting on the edge of the sagging motel bed, staring blankly at the faded floral wallpaper. The shock of Richard discarding her had hardened into a severe, paralyzing depression. I became the sole provider and the caretaker. To hide our destitution, I worked 14-hour shifts. I arrived before the senior partners and stayed long after the janitorial staff emptied the trash bins. When my colleagues went out for overpriced sushi lunches, I politely declined, claiming I had too many files to review. In reality, I could not afford to split a restaurant bill. Instead, I lived on cheap Delaware-style fried chicken from a small corner shack near the office. The grease would soak through the thin cardboard boxes as I ate at my desk, reviewing endless digital pages of incorporation documents. I had to ensure Evelyn never suspected the catastrophic implosion of my personal life. Firms like Rossi and Associates dealt with the confidential assets of billionaires. They required their employees to be beyond reproach. If Evelyn discovered her new analyst was currently living out of a motel due to a volatile, high-profile domestic dispute involving a prominent local CEOI, would be flagged as a liability and terminated. So I built a wall of perfect professional competence. I spoke only of regulations, filing deadlines, and compliance audits. During those long, quiet evenings in the office, something fascinating began to happen. The repetitive, grueling work of tracking corporate registrations stopped being a chore. It became an education. I sat alone in the glow of my dual monitors, parsing through the dense, convoluted structures of Delaware limited liability companies. I watched how vast fortunes were moved through a maze of shell corporations. A billionaire would funnel money into a holding company registered to a generic post office box in Dover. That holding company would then purchase real estate or transfer assets to a blind trust. The actual human being pulling the strings remained invisible, shielded by layers of legal paperwork and registered agents who were bound by confidentiality. I was not just doing my job. I was learning the exact anatomy of financial deception. The men whose files I reviewed thought the exact same way my father thought. They believed that if they layered their money deep enough, no one would ever be smart enough to trace the origin. They relied on the fact that entry-level analysts usually just checked boxes and filed forms without looking at the bigger picture. But I looked at the bigger picture. My brain naturally connected the disparate data points. I started noticing the distinct patterns rich men used to hide their wealth before filing for divorce, or the subtle ways they diverted corporate funds to personal luxury accounts. I realized that Richard had not invented a new strategy when he drained our accounts. He had simply used the standard playbook, and because he used the standard playbook, he had left a trail. The seed of my future weapon took root in the quiet hum of that corporate office. By my 4th week, I received my first full paycheck. It was enough to move Helen and me out of the roadside motel and into a tiny ground-floor efficiency apartment on the outskirts of the city. It had scuffed linoleum floors and a window that looked out onto a brick alleyway, but it felt like a fortress. We had a door we could lock. I thought I had successfully stabilized our lives. I thought my long hours and quiet demeanor had shielded me from the blast radius of my father. I was wrong. On a rainy Tuesday morning, Evelyn Rossi's assistant approached my desk and informed me that the managing partner requested my presence in her office immediately. The tone of the assistant was carefully neutral, a detail that immediately set off warning bells in my mind. I saved my work, smoothed the front of my skirt, and walked down the glass-walled corridor. I stepped into Evelyn's expansive corner office. She did not look up from her desk right away. She finished signing a document, capped her silver pen, and folded her hands. "Close the door, Charlotte," she instructed. I closed the heavy oak door. The ambient noise of the busy office vanished, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence. I took a seat in one of the leather guest chairs. Evelyn picked up a printed sheet of paper from her desk and slid it across the polished wood toward me. "I have built this firm on 2 principles," she said, her voice cool and measured: discretion and integrity. Our clients trust us because we do not harbor individuals who bring reputational risk to this floor. I looked down at the paper. It was a printed email sent directly to the firm's Central Ethics and Human Resources Department. The sender address was encrypted, but the subject line was clear: background check, notification regarding Charlotte Miller. I read the body of the text. The words detailed a toxic, fabricated narrative. It claimed I had been fired from a previous internship for corporate theft. It stated I suffered from severe mental instability following a public, humiliating breakdown at my university graduation. It advised the firm to audit my computer access immediately, suggesting I was actively stealing client data to sell on the black market. A cold, creeping dread washed over me. Richard would never send an email like this. He preferred to pretend I did not exist. This sloppy, venomous tactic belonged to someone who thrived on petty destruction, someone who wanted to ensure I was driven out of the professional world entirely. Vanessa. I looked up from the paper meeting Evelyn Rossi's unwavering stare. The precarious foundation I had just built for my mother and myself was standing on the edge of a cliff, and my father's mistress had just placed her hands on our backs. I sat in the leather guest chair across from Evelyn Rossi and looked at the printed email. The text was designed to sound like a concerned whistleblower warning a prestigious law firm about a dangerous new hire. It claimed I was a thief. It claimed I was unstable. It was a calculated attempt to sever my only source of income and drive me out of the Wilmington corporate sector entirely. Evelyn watched me closely. She was waiting for the standard reaction. She expected me to panic, to cry, or to launch into a frantic emotional defense of my character. Women in her position despised emotional liability. They fired people who brought unpredictable drama into their pristine corridors. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I placed the paper back onto the polished mahogany desk and aligned its edges perfectly with the corner of Evelyn's blotter. "You run a firm built on data," I said, keeping my tone crisp and even. "So let us look at the data. I have been employed here for exactly 28 days. In that time, your IT department has monitored every keystroke I have made. I have not accessed a single client file outside of my direct assignments. I have never downloaded a document to an external drive. My digital footprint is flawless. If I were stealing corporate data, your internal security matrix would have flagged me weeks ago." Evelyn did not blink. She steepled her fingers together. "Go on," she instructed. "The allegations regarding my previous internship are verifiably false," I continued. "You have my university transcripts and the direct contact information for the compliance program director who supervised my placement. A 5-minute phone call will confirm I left that internship with the highest possible performance rating." I paused, holding her sharp gaze. Then I addressed the core issue. As for the claim that I am mentally unstable following a public incident at my graduation, that is a twisted version of a factual event. 10 days ago, my father, Richard Miller, attempted to publicly introduce his mistress at my commencement ceremony. I responded by reading the receipts of his infidelity to the crowd. He disowned me in the parking lot and evicted my mother from our family home. The woman who sent you this encrypted email is that mistress. Her name is Vanessa. She is aware I am working in the same corporate registry circles where my father operates his logistics empire. She is trying to eliminate me from the playing field. The heavy silence returned to the office. The ambient hum of the city traffic drifting through the floor-to-ceiling windows felt unusually loud. I had just laid my greatest vulnerability on the table. I had exposed the chaotic reality of my personal life to a boss who demanded perfection. Evelyn picked up the printed email, crumpled it into a tight sphere, and tossed it into the wastebasket beside her desk. "I despise amateur hour," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. "If someone wants to assassinate the character of one of my analysts, they should have the spine to sign their name. Anonymous emails are the tools of cowards and fools." She opened a thick manila folder on her desk and extracted a stack of highly complex corporate audits. She slid them across the desk toward me. "You handled that accusation exactly how an investigator should, Charlotte. You removed your ego from the equation and relied on verifiable evidence. That tells me you have the temperament for this industry. I do not care about your family disputes. I care about your output. Keep your digital footprint spotless. Keep your head down and finish these audits by Thursday." I took the files. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. Evelyn had just shielded me. By handing me higher-level work instead of a termination notice, she silently established herself as my mentor. She recognized my resilience and chose to cultivate it. I walked out of her office with my job secured and a renewed sense of purpose. I had successfully defended my territory, but my victory was short-lived. The relief I felt during the commute home vanished the moment I unlocked the door to our cramped ground-floor apartment. The air inside smelled faintly of stale bleach and old plumbing. The sole window let in the dim gray light of the fading afternoon. Helen was sitting at the small laminate kitchen table. She was not crying, which worried me more than tears. She was staring at a heavy piece of cream-colored cardstock resting on the cheap tabletop. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow and irregular. "Mom," I said, dropping my bag by the door and rushing to her side. "What happened?" Helen slowly lifted a trembling finger and pointed toward the door. "She came here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She found us." A surge of cold fury ignited in my chest. "Vanessa!" She had not stopped at the anonymous email to my employer. When that failed to produce the immediate destruction she desired, she decided to strike at the weakest target available. Helen wrapped her arms around her own torso, shivering despite the humid Delaware heat creeping through the thin walls. "I was walking back from the grocery store," Helen explained. A silver Mercedes pulled into the alleyway. She stepped out wearing designer heels on the broken concrete. "She looked at this building and she laughed, Charlotte. She told me Richard wanted her to see how the other half lives. She told me I belonged in the dirt." My hands balled into tight fists. Vanessa had tracked us down. She likely hired a private investigator using my father's logistics funds, or she simply pulled our names from the public utility registries I had set up for the apartment. She invaded our only safe space just to twist the knife. Then she taped that to the door, Helen said, gesturing to the heavy cardstock on the table. I reached out and picked up the paper. It was a premium custom-embossed wedding invitation. The elegant calligraphy looped across the page in gold foil. It formally invited the recipient to celebrate the union of Richard Miller and Vanessa at an exclusive country club estate later that fall. Vanessa had delivered her own wedding invitation to the woman whose marriage she had just destroyed. It was a grotesque display of dominance. It was designed to shatter my mother's remaining will to live, and to remind me that we were nothing more than discarded trash in their eyes. Helen finally broke. She buried her face in her hands and let out a hollow, agonizing sob. She took everything, Charlotte. She took the house, she took the money, and now she is standing on our doorstep wearing the clothes Richard bought her, laughing at us. We cannot hide from them. They have all the power. I looked down at the gold foil lettering of the invitation. The thick paper felt heavy in my hand. I thought about Evelyn Rossi tossing the anonymous email into the wastebasket. I thought about the files sitting on my desk at the firm, the intricate webs of shell companies and hidden assets I spent 14 hours a day unraveling. I did not rip the invitation to pieces. I did not throw it away. I walked over to the peeling drywall above our small kitchen counter and pinned the thick cardstock directly to the wall. Helen looked up, her tear-streaked face reflecting profound confusion. "Why are you keeping that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because we are done hiding," I told her. My voice was calm, but the cold determination anchoring my words was entirely new. We had spent the last month playing defense. We ran from the graduation stage. We retreated from the empty bank accounts. We cowered in cheap motels and ground-floor efficiency apartments, hoping they would eventually leave us alone. But Vanessa and Richard did not want peace. They wanted total submission. They wanted us to starve in the shadows while they paraded their new wealth in the sunlight. Defending ourselves was a losing strategy. As long as Richard controlled his logistics empire and his hidden bank accounts, he could hire investigators, send malicious emails, and terrorize my mother whenever he pleased. I stared at the gold foil names on the wedding invitation. Richard Miller, Vanessa. Richard hid his money the same way every wealthy corporate CEO in Delaware hid their money. He used anonymous limited liability companies. He funneled assets through registered agents. He played the corporate shell game. I was an analyst at one of the top registry firms in the state. I spent my days dissecting those exact games. They do not have all the power, I said, turning back to my mother. They just have the money. But money leaves a paper trail, Mom. And I know exactly how to read it. I am going to find out where Dad hid your savings. I am going to track every dollar he diverted to her. The psychological warfare had officially escalated. Vanessa wanted to ensure I was driven out of the corporate world. Instead, she had just motivated me to use that world as a weapon. They forced me into a corner expecting me to surrender. They were about to discover what happens when you trap a compliance investigator who has nothing left to lose. The air inside the cramped apartment felt heavy thick with the lingering scent of stale coffee and impending rain. Helen was finally asleep in the narrow bedroom, exhausted by the trauma of Vanessa's visit. I sat at the small kitchen table, bathed in the harsh blue light of my laptop screen. The golden wedding invitation remained pinned to the wall, a gleaming, silent taunt. I opened a secure browser window. My daytime job at Rossi & Associates required me to navigate the labyrinth of Delaware's corporate registries with precision. I tracked the legitimate movements of wealth for billionaires. Tonight, I was applying those same forensic skills to my own bloodline. I was hunting Richard Miller. Richard's logistics empire, Miller Freight Solutions, was a private entity. He did not have to report his financials to the Securities and Exchange Commission like a publicly traded corporation. He controlled the board, he controlled the ledgers, and he controlled the narrative. But even private companies leave footprints when they move capital. They have to pay taxes, they have to register vendors, and they have to file property deeds. I started with the public records. I pulled up the state business entity search database. My fingers moved rapidly over the keyboard, typing in the names of the primary holding companies Richard had established over the last 2 decades. The screen populated with a long list of limited liability companies, most of them registered to generic post office boxes in Dover or Wilmington. I spent 4 hours cross-referencing the directors listed on those LLCs. The work was tedious, mind-numbing data extraction. My eyes burned from the glare of the monitor. The silence of the apartment was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the keys and the occasional rumble of a delivery truck down the back alley. I needed to find the specific vehicles Richard used to drain the joint accounts on the day of my graduation. I needed to see where the money went after it left the bank. My breakthrough occurred at 3 a.m. I was reviewing a series of vendor payouts filed under Miller Freight Solutions. Richard's company regularly contracted with independent trucking fleets and warehouse operators. The disbursements were usually routine, predictable amounts paid out on a 30-day cycle. But I noticed an anomaly in the ledger from late May, just 3 weeks prior to the graduation incident. A series of unusually large payments had been authorized to a new vendor listed as Coastal Horizon Logistics, LLC. The payments were staggered over 5 days, breaking the total amount into smaller increments. To a casual observer or a junior accountant, it might look like a standard invoice settlement for a new shipping route. But I was not a casual observer. I recognized the structural pattern of the transactions. The staggered payments were a classic technique used to avoid triggering internal auditing flags. Someone was manually pushing large sums of capital out of the primary business account under the guise of vendor expenses. I copied the name Coastal Horizon Logistics, LLC, and fed it into the state registry database. The search results loaded. The LLC had been incorporated in early April. It had no listed physical address, no website, and no commercial freight licenses registered with the Department of Transportation. It was a ghost company, a hollow shell created for the sole purpose of receiving funds. The registered agent for Coastal Horizon was a generic corporate services firm in Wilmington designed to shield the identity of the true owner. Richard was playing the game well. He had layered the transaction to ensure his name was nowhere near the receiving entity. But Richard suffered from the fatal flaw of all narcissistic men. He believed he was the smartest person in the room, which meant he inevitably grew sloppy with the details. I stared at the screen, analyzing the incorporation documents. Shell companies require a managing member to authorize the opening of an operating bank account. While Delaware law allows the owner to remain anonymous on the public registry, certain secondary filings like local municipal tax forms or specific property acquisitions often require a direct signature. I pivoted my search strategy. Instead of chasing the LLC through the corporate registry, I cross-referenced the name Coastal Horizon Logistics against the Sussex County property tax records. The loading icon spun on the screen. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The database produced a single hit. In late May, exactly 2 days after the final staggering vendor payment cleared from Miller Freight Solutions Coastal Horizon Logistics, LLC, purchased a piece of prime real estate. I opened the deed transfer document. The property was a luxury beachfront villa located in Dewey Beach, one of the most expensive coastal enclaves in the state. The purchase price was recorded at $2.4 million. It was an all-cash transaction, no mortgage, no financing. Richard had taken the money from his logistics firm, funneled it through a fake vendor, LLC, and used it to buy a multi-million-dollar beach house outright. I scrolled down to the bottom of the digital deed, searching for the authorizing signature. The local municipality required the managing member of the purchasing LLC to sign the property tax declaration form. My breath caught in my throat. The signature looping across the bottom of the document did not belong to Richard Miller. It did not belong to a corporate lawyer or a generic registered agent. The signature read, Vanessa Sterling. I leaned back in the cheap kitchen chair, the harsh blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with terrifying clarity. Richard was not just a cheating husband who decided to leave his wife for a younger woman. He was actively committing corporate fraud to fund his new life. He had embezzled millions of dollars from his own logistics company, disguising the theft as legitimate business expenses. He then used those stolen funds to purchase a luxury Dewey Beach villa, placing the deed entirely under his mistress's name. This was why he drained the joint personal account so aggressively on the day of graduation. He needed to ensure Helen had absolutely zero capital to hire a forensic accountant during the divorce proceedings. He needed her destitute and desperate, willing to accept whatever pitiful settlement he offered before anyone realized the marital assets had been secretly converted into a beach house for Vanessa. Richard was hiding marital assets, and he was using federal corporate embezzlement tactics to do it. A grim smile touched the corners of my mouth. The golden wedding invitation pinned to the wall suddenly looked less like a threat and more like a confession. Vanessa had driven to our apartment to mock my mother, gloating about her new wealth and her impending marriage. She thought she was untouchable because Richard had insulated her with his money and his power. She did not realize that by putting her name on the deed to that Dewey Beach property, she had just implicated herself in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. I pressed the print command on my keyboard. The cheap inkjet printer on the counter whirred to life, slowly spitting out the public registry documents, the anomalous vendor payouts, and the Dewey Beach property deed bearing Vanessa's signature. I gathered the warm pages, stacking them into a neat damning pile. The mystery of our sudden destitution was solved. The public humiliation on the graduation stage was merely the smokescreen for a much darker financial crime. My father had weaponized his corporate power to destroy my mother's future. I placed the stack of documents into a plain manila folder. I had the proof. I had the paper trail. But possessing the evidence and successfully weaponizing it against a wealthy CEO were two vastly different challenges. I needed a legal strategy. I needed a way to force Richard into a corner where his expensive lawyers could not save him. The digital clock on my laptop read 4:30 in the morning. I closed the screen and finally allowed myself to rest. The defensive phase of this war was officially over. Tomorrow, the offensive campaign would begin, but my quiet resolve was shattered mere hours later. At 9 o'clock the next morning, a sharp, authoritative knock hammered against the thin wood of our apartment door. I was pouring a cup of cheap instant coffee for Helen. I set the mug down and approached the door, checking the peephole. A man in a sharp gray suit stood in the dim alleyway, holding a thick, legal-sized envelope. He was not a delivery driver. He had the rigid, impatient posture of a process server. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Charlotte Miller. He asked, his tone clipped and professional. Yes, I replied, my grip tightening on the doorknob. He thrust the heavy envelope into my hands. You and Helen Miller have been served. Have a good day. He turned and walked briskly away without another word. I closed the door and tore open the seal. The heavy, premium paper inside bore the letterhead of one of the most aggressive, high-priced family law firms in Wilmington. I scanned the first page. It was a formal summons. Richard's lawyers were not waiting for the dust to settle. They were launching a preemptive legal strike. They had drafted a divorce settlement and were legally compelling Helen to attend a mediation session to finalize the dissolution of the marriage. They were attempting to force her signature before she had time to realize she was being robbed blind. The high-stakes legal conflict had arrived at our doorstep, and the ticking clock had just been activated. The law offices of Sterling and Vance occupied the top floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking the Christina River. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of white marble-brushed steel accents and expensive modern art. It was designed to project power and diminish anyone who entered seeking mercy. I guided Helen past the reception desk and down a long, soundproofed corridor. My mother wore her best tailored navy suit, the same suit she had worn to my graduation just weeks prior, but the fabric hung loosely on her frame. The rapid weight loss driven by relentless anxiety had transformed her into a brittle, exhausted woman. She clutched her handbag with trembling fingers, terrified of the man she had spent nearly 30 years calling her husband. We were directed into a massive conference room. The mahogany table stretched the length of the room, polished to a mirror shine. Richard was already seated at the head of the table. He looked immaculate in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, radiating the calm, predatory confidence of a CEO who knew he held all the leverage. He casually adjusted the heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist, a deliberate display of the wealth he was attempting to hoard. To his right sat a pair of sharp, aggressive-looking divorce attorneys, their briefcases open, documents meticulously arranged. And seated to his left, wearing an arrogant smirk that mirrored his father's, was my older brother Bradley. Seeing Bradley there felt like a physical blow to my chest. He had traveled down from Manhattan specifically to participate in our mother's financial execution. He was not present to mediate. He was present to ensure Helen surrendered quietly, protecting his future inheritance and his esteemed position within the family hierarchy. I pulled out a heavy leather chair for Helen and sat down next to her. We were positioned directly across the vast expanse of the table, entirely isolated against their united front. Helen Richard began, his tone dripping with patronizing faux sympathy. "I am glad you decided to be reasonable and attend this mediation. I want this process to be as painless as possible for both of us." He gestured to his lead attorney, a man with cold, assessing eyes. The lawyer slid a thick, bound document across the polished mahogany surface toward my mother. "This is the proposed settlement agreement," the attorney stated, his voice flat and clinical. "Mr. Miller is offering a lump sum buyout of $50,000. In exchange, you will relinquish all claims to the Wilmington estate, the joint investment portfolios, and any equity within Miller Freight Solutions. $50,000. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the room. The offer was not merely an insult. It was an act of financial violence. Helen had been married to this man for 28 years. She had built the foundation of his life while he built his logistics empire. The Wilmington estate alone was valued at over $8 million. He was offering her the equivalent of a mid-range sedan in exchange for 3 decades of her life. Helen stared at the thick document. Her breath hitched. "Richard," she whispered, her voice cracking under the immense strain. "The house. The savings. We built this life together. $50,000 will barely cover my living expenses for a year." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together. "I understand this seems sudden, Helen, but the truth is, the logistics sector has taken a severe downturn. Miller Freight Solutions is currently operating at a significant loss. I am taking on massive debt just to keep the lights on. The joint accounts you thought were so robust had to be liquidated to cover emergency operational costs." He delivered the lie with the flawless, practiced ease of a seasoned sociopath. He looked his traumatized wife directly in the eye and claimed poverty, knowing full well he had just funneled $2.4 million in cash to purchase a luxury beach house for his mistress. "The business is failing," Richard continued smoothly. "The Wilmington estate is heavily mortgaged. I am offering you this $50,000 out of the goodness of my heart, pulling from my last remaining personal reserves. It is a clean break. You take the money and you start fresh." "If you refuse this offer," the lead attorney interjected smoothly, playing the role of the enforcer, "Mr. Miller is fully prepared to litigate this divorce through the traditional court system. Given the complex nature of the corporate debts involved, that process will likely take a minimum of 5 to 7 years. During that time, you will receive 0 spousal support. You will be responsible for your own legal fees, which will quickly exceed the $50,000 currently on the table." It was a classic, brutal intimidation tactic. Accept the pitiful crumbs immediately or be bled dry in a relentless legal war of attrition. They knew Helen had no money to hire her own attorney. They knew she was living in a cheap apartment. They were banking on her despair, forcing a rapid surrender. Helen looked at the pen resting beside the settlement document. Her spirit was broken. The sheer exhaustion of the past weeks weighed heavily on her shoulders. She believed Richard's lies because she had spent her entire adult life believing his narratives. She saw no path forward, only years of agonizing court battles she could not afford to fight. She reached a trembling hand toward the silver pen. "Mom, you need to sign the deal," Bradley suddenly spoke up. His voice lacked any warmth. It was sharp and impatient. "Dad is being more than generous given the circumstances. You and Charlotte created a massive public relations disaster at the graduation. You embarrassed the company. You should be grateful he is offering you anything at all. Just sign the paperwork so we can all move on with our lives." The betrayal from her own son shattered the last remaining defense Helen possessed. A silent tear slipped down her cheek. She picked up the pen, her hand shaking violently as she moved to place the nib against the signature line on the final page of the settlement. I did not speak. I simply reached across the table and placed my hand firmly over her trembling fingers. I pressed down physically, halting the movement of the pen. Helen looked at me, confusion and despair clouding her eyes. "Charlotte," she whispered, "I have to. I have no choice. We have nothing." I kept my hand clamped over hers. I slowly lifted my gaze, bypassing the aggressive attorneys and my traitorous brother, and locked eyes directly with Richard Miller. The smug, victorious smile resting on his lips faltered slightly at my lack of submission. "We will not be signing this document today," I stated. My voice was calm, clear, and devoid of the emotional hysteria they expected. Charlotte Richard snapped his temper, flaring the facade of the benevolent patriarch instantly crumbling. "This does not concern you. You have no standing in this room. You are a naive child playing games in an adult world. Tell your mother to sign the document before I withdraw the offer entirely." I removed the pen from Helen's grip and placed it back on the table, pushing it out of her reach. "This settlement is based on the premise that Miller Freight Solutions is operating at a deficit," I said, maintaining steady eye contact with my father. "However, it is standard legal practice to verify such claims before signing away marital assets. My mother is entitled to a reasonable review period to evaluate the financial disclosures." The lead attorney scoffed, leaning forward aggressively. "Your mother has no legal representation, Miss Miller. Reviewing the documents will change nothing. The offer expires when we leave this room." I ignored the lawyer. I kept my focus entirely on Richard. He wanted to play the role of the impoverished businessman. I knew the exact address of the $2.4 million beach house that proved otherwise. I possessed the manila folder filled with the fraudulent vendor payouts. But I could not reveal my hand in this room. If I exposed the embezzlement evidence now without proper legal shielding, Richard's high-priced attorneys would immediately bury the documents under injunctions and retaliate with aggressive corporate espionage charges against me. I needed time to maneuver. "We need 48 hours to review the settlement," I declared. Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh. 48 hours will not magically produce a better deal, Charlotte. You have no money, you have no lawyers, you have nothing." Perhaps I replied coolly, "But if you withdraw this offer today and attempt to force a protracted litigation, the resulting discovery phase will require a forensic audit of Miller Freight Solutions. I am sure a man in your position, managing such complex operational debts, would prefer to avoid the invasive scrutiny of a federal judge digging through your recent vendor payouts." The words landed exactly as intended. Richard's mocking laughter abruptly ceased. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine uncertainty flashing behind his arrogant facade. I had not made a direct accusation. I had simply dropped the phrase vendor payouts into the air. It was a subtle, calculated warning shot. It communicated that I might know more than the naive local girl should know. Bradley looked back and forth between us, sensing the sudden shift in tension, but lacking the specific context to understand why his father had suddenly gone rigid. Richard stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He was calculating the risk. He decided I was bluffing. He believed it was impossible for me to possess actual proof of his complex financial fraud. But he also recognized that pushing for immediate litigation might trigger an unwanted audit. "Fine," Richard bit out, his voice sharp, with restrained fury. "You have 48 hours. If this document is not signed and returned to my attorneys by noon on Friday, the $50,000 offer is permanently rescinded and we go to trial." He stood up abruptly, buttoned his suit jacket, and stormed out of the conference room without another word. His attorneys hastily gathered their files and followed. Bradley lingered for a second, shooting me a glare of profound disgust before trailing after his father. Helen and I were left alone in the vast, silent room. She looked at me, terrified by the confrontation she had just witnessed. "Charlotte, what did you just do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We cannot fight them in court. We do not have the money for a lawyer. Why did you stop me from signing?" I picked up the thick settlement document and shoved it into my tote bag. "Because he is lying, Mom," I told her, my voice dropping to a fierce, protective whisper. "He is hiding millions of dollars, and I know exactly where it is. I just bought us 48 hours to prove it." I had temporarily saved Helen from signing away her entire life for a pitiful fraction of its worth. But the victory was incredibly fragile. The ticking clock had been activated. I had exactly 2 days to transform a manila folder full of raw data into an ironclad legal weapon capable of destroying a millionaire CEO. I stood up and helped my mother to her feet. We walked out of the intimidating glass tower and stepped into the humid Wilmington afternoon. I knew I needed a clear head to assemble the final pieces of the puzzle. I needed to escape the claustrophobic anxiety of the city. "We are not going back to the apartment today," I told Helen as we approached my Honda. "We are driving to the coast. We need to look at the ocean, and I need to show you exactly how your husband bought a new life with your money." We left the stifling concrete canyons of Wilmington behind and drove south on Route 1. The landscape gradually shifted from dense corporate parks to the expansive flat coastal marshes that defined southern Delaware. The sky opened up vast and pale blue, stretching over the swaying green reeds of the wetlands. I rolled down the windows of the Honda, letting the heavy, salty breeze of the Atlantic Ocean flood the cramped cabin. I brought my mother to Rehoboth Beach because she needed the physical distance to breathe. She grew up near these shores. Before Richard Miller became a logistics titan, he was just an ambitious outsider with empty pockets. Helen was a local girl working summers at a boardwalk taffy stand when they met. She used her tight-knit community connections to help him secure the initial bank loans and warehouse leases that launched his career. She laid the bricks of his empire. Now he treated her like debris to be swept away. We parked near the quiet end of the boardwalk and found a cheap coastal motel that smelled of sea salt and old pine cleaner. The off-season quiet provided a stark contrast to the intimidating mahogany conference room we had just escaped. We walked down to the shoreline. The therapeutic rhythm of the Atlantic waves crashing against the pale sand offered a temporary reprieve from the crushing pressure of the 48-hour deadline. Helen stood near the water edge, the salty wind whipping her graying hair around her face. She wrapped her arms around her chest, looking small and intensely vulnerable against the vast expanse of the ocean. "I gave him everything, Charlotte," she said. Her voice was a fragile whisper, nearly lost to the sound of the crashing waves. "My youth, my energy, my entire identity. I stood by him when we had nothing but instant noodles in our pantry, and he sat in that pristine room today and offered me $50,000 like it was a generous tip. I feel entirely worthless." I stepped closer and wrapped my arm around her shoulders. "You are not worthless, Mom," I told her. The value of your life is not dictated by a man who calculates human worth on a spreadsheet. He wants you to feel small because a small opponent is easy to defeat. He wants you paralyzed by despair so you will not fight back. Helen turned to me, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. But how do we fight him? We have no resources. The lawyers in that room looked ready to devour us. We fight him by changing the battlefield. I replied, my voice steady and resolute. We are not going to play a game of marital asset division. We are going to play a game of corporate compliance. I guided her back to the dim motel room. I pulled the worn wooden chair out from the small writing desk and sat down. I opened my tote bag and extracted the manila folder containing the printouts from my late-night registry investigation. I grabbed a pen and a cheap branded hotel notepad from the nightstand. "Sit down, Mom," I instructed. "I am going to show you exactly how your husband bought a new life, and I am going to show you why his arrogance is about to destroy him." Helen sat on the edge of the floral bedspread, watching me with a mixture of apprehension and fragile hope. I drew a large square at the top of the notepad page. "This is Miller Freight Solutions," I explained. "This is the legitimate business, the one generating millions in revenue, the one Richard claims is currently failing and drowning in operational debt." I drew an arrow pointing down to a smaller circle. I wrote Coastal Horizon Logistics inside the circle. "This is a limited liability company created in early April," I said. "Richard authorized a series of immense vendor payouts from the main freight account into this new company. He staggered the payments to avoid setting off internal auditing alarms. He transferred over $2.4 million into this shell entity." Helen stared at the circle. "He stole it from the business," she murmured. "Yes," I confirmed. "But stealing from his own private company is just a civil dispute during a divorce. It proves he is hiding marital assets, which would nullify his settlement offer, but his lawyers could still tie us up in court for years arguing about corporate valuations and equitable distribution. We need something sharper than a civil dispute. We need a criminal vulnerability." I drew a second arrow pointing from the Coastal Horizon circle to a crude sketch of a house. 2 days after the final payout cleared, this shell company purchased a luxury villa in Dewey Beach with cash. I continued, "And because local municipal laws require a managing member to sign the property tax declaration, the true owner of the shell company had to step out of the shadows and put their name on a government document." I slid the printed property deed across the desk. Helen picked it up, her eyes scanning the dense text until they landed on the looping signature at the bottom of the page. Vanessa Sterling. Helen read the name aloud. Her breath hitched. "He gave her the money. He bought her a house." I tapped my pen against the notepad. "He did not just give her the money, Mom. He made her the sole legal owner of the receiving entity. And that brings us to his fatal error." I pulled out a specific ledger sheet I had meticulously analyzed the night before. I placed it next to the property deed. My corporate registry training allowed me to spot the subtle discrepancies in the routing numbers. When you create a shell company to hide money, the golden rule is isolation, I explained, my tone shifting into the cold, clinical rhythm of a compliance investigator. You never mix dirty money with clean operations. But Richard grew sloppy. He did not want to pay the separate banking fees and administrative costs to maintain Vanessa's new LLC as an independent entity. So he linked the Coastal Horizon banking routing numbers directly to the auxiliary payroll accounts of Miller Freight Solutions. Helen looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means co-mingling," I stated. He used the exact same corporate account to buy a beach house for his mistress that he uses to pay the federal payroll taxes for his truck drivers. By linking those accounts and placing Vanessa's signature on the receiving end, he pierced the corporate veil. This is no longer a messy divorce tactic. This is federal corporate embezzlement and tax fraud. The emotional despair that had suffocated my mother for weeks slowly began to dissipate. In its place, a profound, chilling clarity settled over the room. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Richard thought he was starring in a drama about a wealthy CEO trading in his older wife for a younger model. He did not realize he was starring in a tragedy about a man handing federal investigators the exact documentation needed to seize his entire empire. "We have the trap," I told her, stacking the papers back into the manila folder. "We just need the trigger. I need Vanessa to verbally acknowledge that she owns that LLC and the Dewey Beach property. If I can record her admitting ownership, we establish undeniable intent. They will not be able to claim her signature was forged or placed there by accident." Helen sat up straighter, the color finally returning to her pale cheeks. "But how do we get her to admit that? She will not speak to us." Before I could formulate an answer, the sudden sharp buzz of my mother's cell phone shattered the quiet concentration in the room. Helen picked up the device from the nightstand. She looked at the screen, her brow furrowing in confusion. "It is an alert from the security system at the Wilmington estate," she said. "Richard deactivated my entry codes, but my phone is still linked to the front porch camera." She tapped the notification and opened the live video feed. I leaned over her shoulder to look at the small screen. The high-definition camera displayed the grand brick entryway of the home we had been evicted from just weeks ago. Standing on the porch, looking impatient and thoroughly entitled, was Vanessa. She was arguing with a pair of professional moving men. Behind her, resting carefully on a padded dolly, was the antique Dutch colonial grandfather clock that had belonged to my maternal great-grandmother. It was a cherished family heirloom. It had zero connection to Richard or his logistics wealth. I turned up the volume on the phone. Vanessa's shrill voice drifted through the tiny speaker. "Be careful with that," Vanessa snapped at the movers. "It belongs to me now. I am taking it to my new beach house. Load it into the truck before Richard gets back from his meetings." A surge of fierce protective adrenaline coursed through my veins. The emotional devastation of the morning was entirely gone. In its place stood a cold, tactical determination. Vanessa believed her proximity to Richard gave her the right to scavenge the remains of our family history. Her arrogance was blinding her to her own vulnerability. I grabbed the keys to the Honda from the desk. "Where are we going?" Helen asked, watching me sling my tote bag over my shoulder. "We are driving back to Wilmington," I replied. "Vanessa wants to claim her new kingdom. It is time we go help her record the inventory." The drive north took just over an hour. The flat green expanse of the coastal wetlands gradually gave way to the heavy concrete infrastructure of the Wilmington suburbs. I kept the Honda slightly above the speed limit. My phone rested in the center console with a voice recording application open and ready in the background. Helen sat rigid in the passenger seat. That clock belonged to my great-grandmother. Helen murmured, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. "It traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. It survived the Great Depression. It represents the only piece of my Dutch colonial heritage I have left. Richard knows how much it means to me. He is letting her take it just to cause pain." I did not take my eyes off the highway. "Let her attempt to take it," I replied. "We are not going there to fight over antique furniture. We are going there to hand Vanessa enough rope to hang herself." We turned onto the familiar tree-lined street of the estate. A large white moving box truck idled in the circular driveway. The heavy oak front doors of the house stood wide open. Vanessa stood on the top step of the brick porch. She wore a pristine white silk blouse and tailored designer trousers, holding a sleek ceramic coffee cup. She looked like she was staging a photo shoot for a luxury lifestyle magazine. Two burly men in matching work shirts were carefully maneuvering the tall, intricately carved wooden grandfather clock onto a heavy-duty moving dolly. The brass pendulum swung behind the glass casing as the wheels hit the uneven brick. I parked the car at the edge of the driveway. I tapped the screen of my phone, initiating the audio recording. I slid the device deep into the front pocket of my blazer. I instructed my mother to stay inside the vehicle. She needed to remain a silent witness. If she engaged, the conversation would devolve into emotional chaos. I needed clinical, arrogant bragging. I stepped out of the Honda and walked up the paved walkway. Vanessa spotted me immediately. A smug, victorious smile spread across her flawless face. She held up a hand, signaling the movers to pause their work. "Well," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I did not expect visitors today. The security gates were supposed to be reprogrammed. I will have to speak to the technicians about their slow response time." I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I looked at the antique clock, then looked directly at her. "That heirloom belongs to my mother," I stated, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "It is not marital property. It predates the marriage by several decades. You have no legal right to load it onto that truck." Vanessa took a slow sip from her coffee cup. She looked down at me from her elevated position on the porch. Her gaze swept over my scuffed flats and the generic gray blazer I wore to my entry-level registry job. "You are in no position to dictate legal rights to me, Charlotte," she sneered. "You and your mother were evicted. Anything left inside these walls became abandoned property. Richard told me I could furnish my new beach house with whatever I found suitable. I think this old clock will look rustic in the entryway. I needed her to escalate. I needed her to claim the assets explicitly on tape." I dropped my shoulders slightly, adopting the posture of a defeated, desperate daughter. "You already forced my mother out of her home," I said, allowing a strategic note of frustration to enter my voice. "You took the Wilmington house. Is that not enough for you? Why do you need to steal her family history too?" Vanessa laughed. It was a sharp, grating sound that echoed across the manicured lawn. "I am not stealing anything. I am simply claiming what belongs to the new lady of the house. Your mother failed to secure her future. That is her own fault." She took a step closer to the edge of the porch, reveling in the power dynamic. "Richard always told me you were the slow one in the family. Now I see he was right. Look at you. Your brother Bradley went to a real school. He works in Manhattan. He understands how wealth operates. You stayed in this boring state to get a useless local degree, and now you are begging for old furniture on my porch." I swallowed the instinct to defend my education. Let her talk. Let the arrogance flow. My degree taught me how corporate assets work. I countered weakly, playing the naive victim perfectly. "I know my father bought that beach house with his logistics money. He just lets you stay there. It is not yours." The bait was set. Vanessa possessed a fragile ego that demanded constant validation. She could not bear the implication that she was merely a kept woman living in property owned by someone else. She needed to prove her dominance over the first wife and the local daughter. "You really are clueless," Vanessa scoffed, her voice rising in volume. "Richard does not just let me stay there. I own the Dewey Beach House. My name is on the deed. My personal company bought it." I shook my head, feigning disbelief. "You do not have that kind of money. That villa cost millions." Vanessa leaned over the brick railing, eager to crush my assumptions. "I do not need my own money when I own a piece of the logistics company, little girl. Coastal Horizon Logistics is mine. My signature is on every operating document. Richard transferred the funds directly into my holding accounts because he trusts me. He made me a shareholder in his operations to ensure my future is untouchable. I control those assets now." The digital recorder in my pocket captured every single word. She had just confessed to the entire scheme. In her desperate attempt to prove she was superior, she explicitly admitted to owning the shell company. She admitted to signing the operating documents. She proudly declared she received the diverted funds from Miller Freight Solutions and used them to secure the Dewey Beach property. The trap snapped shut with a resounding, invisible finality. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and let the defeated posture fall away. I straightened my spine. The artificial frustration vanished from my face, replaced by the cold, calculating gaze of a compliance investigator who had just secured the final piece of evidence required to execute a federal indictment. Vanessa noticed the shift. Her smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She did not understand why the girl in the cheap blazer suddenly looked like a predator who had cornered her prey. "Load the clock onto the truck," I told the movers, breaking the silence. The two men looked at me, then looked at Vanessa, unsure of who held the actual authority. I turned my attention back to my father's mistress. "Enjoy the antique, Vanessa," I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any lingering tension. "It requires winding every 8 days to keep the correct time. Make sure you take good care of it." I turned my back on her and walked calmly down the driveway toward my car. I did not look back. I did not need to see her confused expression. The battle on the porch was over, and the war was fundamentally won. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat. Helen stared at me, her face pale and stricken with grief, as she watched the movers load the heavy wooden clock into the dark cavern of the box truck. "You let her take it," Helen whispered, a tear escaping the corner of her eye. She took my history. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stopped the audio recording. I saved the file to a secure cloud server, backing it up instantly. I reached over and squeezed her hand. I let her take a piece of wood, Mom. In exchange, she just handed us the keys to Richard's entire empire. She admitted to owning the receiving entity on tape. We have the financial ledgers, the property deed, and now the verbal confession. The embezzlement case is airtight. Helen wiped her cheek, processing the magnitude of the victory. What happens next? Do we call the police? Do we call his lawyers? I put the car in gear and pulled out of the circular driveway, leaving the Wilmington estate behind in the rearview mirror. We cannot go directly to the police, I explained, navigating the suburban streets. A recorded conversation can be tricky to admit into a civil divorce proceeding without violating specific consent laws. Furthermore, if we approach Richard's high-priced attorneys right now, they will file an emergency injunction to bury this evidence in sealed arbitration. They will use their immense financial leverage to silence us before a judge ever sees the documents. I merged onto the highway, heading toward the towering glass structures of the corporate district. I need professional legal shielding, I continued. I need someone who understands the exact architecture of Delaware corporate fraud. Someone who wields enough power in this city to make Richard's lawyers tremble. Who, Helen asked. My boss, I replied. I was driving us straight to Rossi and Associates. I had spent weeks carefully hiding my chaotic personal life from Evelyn Rossi, presenting myself as the perfect, untroubled analyst. Now I was about to walk into her immaculate corner office and place a federal corporate embezzlement scandal directly on her desk. I was risking my only source of income, my nascent career, and my professional reputation. If Evelyn deemed the situation too radioactive, she would fire me on the spot, and Helen and I would be left truly defenseless. The stakes had shifted from an investigation to a high-wire act of professional survival. The glass double doors of Rossi and Associates slid open, welcoming me into the hushed, climate-controlled sanctuary of elite corporate compliance. The air smelled of expensive espresso and polished leather. It was a stark contrast to the humid, emotionally charged confrontation on the porch of the Wilmington estate just an hour prior. I left Helen waiting in the reception area. She sat stiffly on a minimalist sofa, clutching her purse. I walked down the long corridor toward Evelyn Rossi's corner office. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I carried a thick manila folder containing the printouts of Richard's fraudulent vendor payouts, the Dewey Beach property deed, and a USB drive holding the audio recording of Vanessa's confession. This was the most perilous moment of my nascent career. I was an entry-level analyst. My job was to process documents, not weaponize them against prominent local CEOs. Using my knowledge of the state corporate registries to conduct a personal investigation skirted the edge of professional ethics. If Evelyn interpreted my actions as a liability to her firm's reputation for discretion, she would terminate my employment instantly. I would lose the only paycheck keeping my mother and me out of a homeless shelter. I reached the heavy oak door and knocked twice. Enter, Evelyn called out. I pushed the door open. Evelyn was seated behind her expansive desk, reviewing a dense contract. She wore a sharp charcoal blazer, her silver bob perfectly styled. She did not look up immediately. "What is it, Charlotte?" she asked, signing the bottom of the page with her silver fountain pen. "I need 10 minutes of your time, Ms. Rossi," I said, "and I need you to review a file off the official record." Evelyn stopped writing. She slowly capped her pen and lifted her gaze. Her dark, assessing eyes locked onto mine. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Off the official record, Evelyn repeated, her tone cooling. "You have been employed here for barely a month, Charlotte. You do not have the seniority to request off-the-record reviews. If you have uncovered an irregularity in a client account, you flag it through the proper compliance channels." "This is not a client account," I replied. I stepped forward and placed the manila folder directly onto the center of her pristine desk. "This concerns my father, Richard Miller, and it concerns the anonymous email that was sent to Human Resources last week attempting to terminate my employment." Evelyn stared at the folder. She did not reach for it. "I told you to ignore that amateur attempt at character assassination and focus on your work. Are you bringing personal drama into my office?" I am bringing a textbook case of federal corporate embezzlement into your office, I corrected her, maintaining direct eye contact. My father is attempting to force my mother into a $50,000 divorce settlement by claiming Miller Freight Solutions is operating at a severe deficit. He threatened to drag her through a decade of litigation if she refuses. I used my compliance training to audit his public filings. I found the money. He diverted over $2.4 million from the logistics firm to purchase a beach house for the woman who sent you that email. Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. She let the silence stretch, evaluating my posture, my tone, and my audacity. I was a 22-year-old recent graduate standing in the office of one of the most powerful corporate registry fixers in Delaware, casually alleging a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme against a known logistics titan. She finally reached out and opened the folder. I watched her eyes track across the pages. She reviewed the staggered vendor payouts to Coastal Horizon Logistics. She examined the Dewey Beach property deed. She noted Vanessa Sterling's signature at the bottom of the tax declaration form. "You track this through the public county property registries," Evelyn observed quietly, not looking up. "Yes," I confirmed. "And the connection between the receiving entity and the auxiliary payroll accounts. I noticed the routing discrepancies in the public filings," I said. "He co-mingled the funds. He used the exact same corporate account to buy the villa that he uses to pay his truck drivers." Evelyn turned to the final page in the folder. It was a transcript I had typed up in the car detailing the audio recording of Vanessa's confession on the porch. "I have the audio file on a secure drive," I added. She explicitly admits to owning the LLC, receiving the diverted funds, and possessing the deed to the property. Evelyn finished reading the transcript. She closed the manila folder. She picked up her silver fountain pen and tapped it once against the polished wood of her desk. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. "Richard Miller is a fool," Evelyn stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "He utilized the most basic, outdated methods of asset concealment. He thought he could hide corporate capital behind a generic LLC without ensuring structural isolation. He thought because I was young and stayed local for college, I was blind to how the system operates," I said. "He assumed no one in his family understood the mechanics of his wealth." Evelyn leaned back in her leather chair, studying me with a newfound intensity. The initial frostiness had vanished, replaced by a calculating professional respect. She recognized the exact nature of the game I was playing. "If you take this evidence to his divorce attorneys, they will immediately file a gag order," Evelyn explained, outlining the tactical reality. "They will claim the audio recording was obtained illegally regardless of the single-party consent laws in this state. They will drag the authenticity of these documents through endless arbitration. They will bleed your mother dry with legal fees before a judge ever sees this folder." "I know," I replied. "That is why I brought the file to you. I cannot execute this strike alone. I lack the legal authority and the institutional intimidation factor required to bypass his attorneys and force a surrender." "You are asking me to represent your mother in a divorce proceeding," Evelyn clarified. "This is a corporate registry firm, Charlotte. We do not handle domestic disputes." "This is not a domestic dispute," I countered. "This is a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a marital settlement. If Richard falls under federal investigation for embezzlement, it will send shockwaves through the local logistics sector. It will draw unwanted regulatory scrutiny to the corporate structures in Wilmington. You have built a career protecting the integrity of this state's corporate haven. Richard's sloppy fraud is a liability to the ecosystem you maintain." Evelyn stared at me. A slow, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was a predator recognizing another predator. "You learned how to leverage institutional power very quickly, Charlotte. I learned from reading the files you assigned to me," I replied smoothly. Evelyn opened her top drawer and extracted a heavy, cream-colored client intake form. She uncapped her silver pen. "Bring your mother into my office," Evelyn instructed. "I am taking Helen Miller on as a pro bono client effective immediately. By establishing attorney-client privilege with her, I legally shield this investigation. Any documents you uncovered during your research are now classified as part of our formal discovery process. You are no longer a rogue analyst risking your career. You are a legal investigator operating under my direct authorization." The immense weight of the professional risk lifted from my shoulders. The crushing anxiety that had plagued me since I initiated the search vanished. I had secured the ultimate protector. Evelyn Rossi was not just a lawyer. She was an architect of corporate strategy. With her backing, my findings were untouchable. "Thank you, Ms. Rossi," I said, feeling the profound relief settle into my bones. Evelyn waved her hand dismissively. "Do not thank me yet. Richard Miller and his high-priced attorneys believe they hold all the leverage. They are expecting a terrified, destitute woman to walk into mediation tomorrow and sign her life away for $50,000. Evelyn closed the manila folder and rested her hand flat against the cover. "Let us show him how Delaware corporate law actually works," she said. I left the corner office and walked down the corridor to retrieve my mother from the reception area. The ticking clock of the 48-hour deadline no longer felt like a countdown to our destruction. It felt like the countdown to an ambush. We had the evidence. We had the legal shielding. We had the element of total surprise. But as I guided Helen back toward Evelyn's office to sign the intake forms, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a calendar notification. The mediation session was scheduled for noon the following day. Richard would arrive expecting a swift victory. He would bring his lawyers, his arrogance, and my brother Bradley. Bradley, the golden child, who had told my mother to take the pitiful settlement and be grateful. A cold realization settled over me. Richard had co-mingled the logistics funds to buy the beach house. But Richard did not manage the daily accounting authorizations alone. Bradley was a listed advisory board member for Miller Freight Solutions. If the corporate veil was pierced by a federal embezzlement investigation, the fallout would not be contained to Richard alone. The explosion would incinerate anyone whose signature appeared on the falsified financial reports. The trap I had set for my father was about to catch my brother as well. The 48-hour deadline expired precisely at noon on a heavy overcast Thursday. Helen and I arrived at the law offices of Sterling and Vance 15 minutes early. We did not wait in the intimidating marble reception area. Evelyn Rossi had sent her senior paralegal to escort us directly to the largest executive conference room on the top floor. The room was designed for corporate warfare, featuring an expansive mahogany table that gleamed under the harsh recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping gray view of the Wilmington skyline, the Delaware River winding sluggishly below. Helen sat beside me. She looked entirely different than the terrified, broken woman who had occupied this exact same chair 2 days ago. Evelyn had spent the previous evening preparing her for the psychological onslaught that was about to occur. Helen wore a sharp, structured blazer. Her posture was straight, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She no longer projected the vulnerability of a discarded wife. She projected the quiet resilience of a woman who knew she held the winning hand. At exactly 12 o'clock, the heavy double doors swung open. Richard Miller entered the room. He walked with the sweeping, entitled stride of a man who believed the world existed solely to cater to his whims. He wore a navy bespoke suit, checking his Rolex with an air of practiced impatience. Flanking him were his 2 aggressive divorce attorneys, clutching their thick leather briefcases. Trailing closely behind Richard was Vanessa. She had decided to attend the mediation session. She wore a tailored white dress, carrying a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. She looked around the somber conference room with feigned boredom, treating the dissolution of a nearly 30-year marriage as a minor inconvenience in her day. She wanted to be present to witness Helen's surrender. She wanted to watch the final eradication of the first family. And finally, bringing up the rear, was Bradley. My older brother looked exhausted. His pristine Manhattan investment banker facade showed slight cracks. The dark circles under his eyes suggested the stress of maintaining Richard's corporate fictions was taking a toll. He took a seat at the far end of the table and immediately focused his attention on his phone, pointedly refusing to make eye contact with me or our mother. Richard did not sit down immediately. He stood at the head of the mahogany table, placing his hands flat against the polished wood. He surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on the empty chair beside me. "I see you failed to secure legal representation." Charlotte Richard noted a cruel, victorious smile spreading across his face. He assumed Evelyn Rossi was not attending. He assumed our request for 48 hours had yielded nothing but further desperation. I did not respond. I simply looked at him, maintaining a flat, unreadable expression. Evelyn had specifically instructed me to let Richard talk. Narcissists invariably provide their own rope if you give them enough silence. They cannot resist the urge to perform their perceived dominance. Helen, Richard continued, turning his attention to my mother. The smile vanished, replaced by a cold, reprimanding glare. I allowed you this 48-hour extension as a final courtesy. A courtesy you frankly did not deserve after the grotesque spectacle you and your daughter created at the university graduation. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and finally took his seat. His lead attorney immediately slid the thick settlement document across the table, positioning it precisely in front of Helen. The silver pen rested beside it, waiting for the signature that would legally strip her of everything. I expect you have spent the last 2 days reflecting on the reality of your situation, Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair. The $50,000 offer remains on the table. It is the only offer you will ever receive. He began his monologue. It was a performance designed to rewrite history, casting himself as the benevolent provider who had been victimized by an ungrateful family. I spent 28 years carrying the financial burden of this family. Richard stated, his voice rising in volume, filling the quiet room. I built Miller Freight Solutions from the ground up while you hosted garden parties and spent my money. You bled me dry, Helen. You enjoyed the estate, the cars, and the social status, but you never understood the intense operational pressures I faced every single day to maintain that lifestyle. Vanessa sighed loudly, picking up her phone and scrolling through her social media feeds. She was visually communicating her extreme boredom with the proceedings. She leaned over and whispered something to Richard's junior attorney, sharing a quiet, mocking laugh. The logistics sector is currently experiencing a massive contraction, Richard pressed on, entirely ignoring Vanessa's distraction. Fuel costs are astronomical. Vendor rates have skyrocketed. My company is operating at a severe deficit. The millions of dollars you assumed were sitting in our joint accounts simply do not exist anymore. They were liquidated to cover emergency corporate debts. He gestured expansively toward the settlement document. I am pulling this $50,000 from my last remaining personal reserves. I am doing this because I am a fair man. I want to provide you with a clean break so you can start over in whatever small local life you choose to live now. But my patience is entirely exhausted. Bradley finally looked up from his phone. He directed a sharp, reprimanding glare toward our mother. Mom just signed the paper. Dad is trying to save the company from bankruptcy. We are all making sacrifices right now. Do not drag this out and force him to litigate. The legal fees will destroy whatever minor capital he has left to salvage the business operations. My brother was actively aiding in the financial execution of our mother to protect his own future inheritance. He believed Richard's lie about the failing business. Or perhaps he simply did not care, as long as his position as the heir apparent was secured. Richard leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. The performance reached its crescendo. You have exactly 2 choices today, Helen. You sign that document right now, take the $50,000 and walk out of here. Or you refuse, and my attorneys will file a motion to freeze all remaining marital assets indefinitely. We will drag you through the federal court system for the next 7 years. I will employ forensic accountants to scrutinize every single dollar you ever spent during our marriage. I will ensure you spend the rest of your life buried in legal debt, living in a cheap roadside motel. He stared at her, his eyes cold and devoid of any humanity. The choice is yours. Sign it, or prepare to lose everything. The suffocating tension in the room reached its absolute peak. The silence was heavy, oppressive, and designed to break a person's spirit. Richard had delivered his final threat. He sat back, crossing his arms over his chest, waiting for Helen to pick up the silver pen and surrender her life. I looked at Vanessa, who was still scrolling on her phone. I looked at Bradley, who was shifting uncomfortably under the weight of his own betrayal. I looked at the aggressive attorneys poised and ready to enforce the draconian terms. And then I looked at my father. I did not reach for the pen to stop my mother. I did not need to. Helen simply stared back at Richard, her expression calm and entirely unbothered by his theatrical rage. The heavy double doors of the conference room swung open with a resounding thud. Everyone at the mahogany table jumped slightly at the sudden intrusion. Richard turned his head sharply, furious that his carefully orchestrated intimidation tactic had been interrupted. Evelyn Rossi walked into the room. She did not rush. She moved with the slow, terrifying grace of an apex predator entering a familiar hunting ground. She wore a tailored crimson suit that stood out sharply against the drab corporate gray of the room. She carried 3 thick, black, heavily bound folders under her arm. Richard's lead attorney immediately scrambled to his feet. "Excuse me?" the attorney demanded, his voice defensive and sharp. "This is a private mediation session. You are not authorized to be in this room." Evelyn ignored the attorney completely. She walked the length of the mahogany table, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing against the hardwood floor. She stopped directly behind my chair. She placed her hands on the back of my seat and looked down the table at Richard Miller. "I am Evelyn Rossi, managing partner of Rossi & Associates," she announced. Her voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable lethal authority. "I am the legal counsel of record for Helen Miller, and we are not here to sign your pitiful settlement document, Richard. We are here to discuss your imminent federal indictment." The name Rossi & Associates triggered an immediate physical reaction from the attorneys across the table. The lead lawyer sank slowly back into his leather chair, the aggressive bluster entirely gone from his posture. Richard's smug smile vanished, replaced by a rigid, cautious glare. He recognized Evelyn's name. Every corporate executive in Delaware knew the reputation of the firm that managed the registry compliance for the state's most powerful entities. Richard recovered his composure quickly, relying on his deep well of arrogance. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany surface. "I do not care what prestigious firm you claim to represent." Richard stated, his voice tight with restrained fury. "Helen has 0 assets. She cannot afford your retainer. You are wasting your billable hours, Ms. Rossi. Furthermore, throwing around empty threats about federal indictments during a civil divorce proceeding is a severe breach of professional ethics. If you have evidence of a crime, you take it to the authorities. You do not use it to extort a better divorce settlement." Evelyn did not flinch. She did not argue the point. She simply stepped to the side and gestured toward me. "I am not here to negotiate your divorce settlement, Mr. Miller," Evelyn replied smoothly. "I am here solely to provide legal shielding for my lead investigator." Evelyn picked up the 3 thick, black, heavily bound folders she had brought into the room. She placed them directly in front of me. I stood up. The dynamic in the room fundamentally fractured. For 22 years, I had been the quiet, overlooked daughter. I was the girl they sent to the back of the room during corporate dinners. I was the local disappointment who lacked the Ivy League pedigree they worshipped. Now I was standing at the mediation table, flanked by one of the most terrifying corporate attorneys in the state, holding the explosive leverage that could dismantle their entire reality. I picked up the first black folder and slid it precisely across the polished wood. It stopped directly in front of Richard's lead attorney. I slid the second folder toward Bradley. I kept the third folder in front of me. I opened the cover. The crisp white pages inside detailed the precise, devastating architecture of my father's financial crimes. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I utilized the cold, clinical, and precise tone of a senior compliance auditor delivering a terminal diagnostic report. "You stated that Miller Freight Solutions is currently operating at a severe deficit." I began looking directly into Richard's eyes. "You claimed that the joint marital accounts were liquidated to cover emergency operational debts caused by a contracting logistics sector." Richard's jaw tightened. He refused to look away. "That is a documented fact, Charlotte. My accountants can provide the ledgers." "Your accountants provided falsified ledgers," I corrected him seamlessly. "They disguised Capital Flight as vendor payouts." Beginning on May 12th of this year, Miller Freight Solutions authorized a series of 5 staggered disbursements totaling $2.4 million. These funds were directed to a newly registered vendor listed as Coastal Horizon Logistics, LLC. The color began to drain from Richard's face. It was not a subtle shift. The vibrant, healthy flush of the victorious CEO vanished, leaving behind a pale, sickly gray. Coastal Horizon. Logistics is not a legitimate shipping vendor, I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. It holds no commercial freight licenses with the Department of Transportation. It is a shell entity incorporated in early April. 2 days after the final disbursement of the $2.4 million, cleared Coastal Horizon Logistics purchased a luxury villa in Dewey Beach in an all-cash transaction. I flipped to the second page in my folder. I have provided the certified property deed in your files. I instructed the attorneys across the table. You will note that the authorizing signature on the municipal tax declaration form does not belong to a registered agent. It belongs to the managing member of the LLC. I turned my gaze away from Richard and focused entirely on the woman sitting next to him. Vanessa had stopped scrolling on her phone. Her designer handbag sat forgotten on the table. She stared at me, her eyes wide with mounting panic. "The signature belongs to Vanessa Sterling," I stated. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the conference room seemed to turn solid. The rhythmic ticking of a decorative clock on the far wall was the only sound breaking the terrible stillness. Richard's lead attorney frantically flipped open the black folder. He scanned the highlighted bank routing numbers, the public registry and corporation dates, and the certified copy of the Dewey Beach property deed. His professional demeanor crumbled as he processed the sheer scale of his client's amateur fraud. "This is inadmissible." Richard choked out, his voice a hoarse, desperate rasp. He stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. "You illegally accessed my private corporate ledgers. This is corporate espionage." "I did not access your private ledgers," I replied, maintaining my calm posture. "Every single document in that folder was obtained legally through public state registry databases and county property tax records. You left a glaring paper trail because you commingled the funds. You linked the Coastal Horizon routing numbers directly to your auxiliary payroll accounts to avoid paying separate administrative fees." I looked back at Vanessa. "When you create a shell company to hide stolen corporate assets, the owner must remain strictly anonymous." I explained to her, adopting the tone of a teacher correcting a slow student. "But Richard wanted to ensure you felt secure. He put your name on the deed to the beach house. By doing so, he legally tied you to the receiving entity of the embezzled funds." Vanessa's flawless facade shattered. She looked at Richard, her voice rising in a panicked shrill. "You told me the money was clean. You told me it was a legitimate corporate dividend." Richard did not look at her. He stared at the black folder on the table, realizing the inescapable reality of the trap. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I did not slide this one across the table. I walked over and handed it directly to Vanessa. "This is the transcript of our conversation on the porch of the Wilmington estate 2 days ago," I informed her. "I recorded the interaction. In this transcript, you explicitly state that you own Coastal Horizon Logistics. You admit that Richard transferred the funds directly into your holding accounts. You claim control of those assets." Vanessa stared at the typed words on the page. Her hands trembled violently. The designer white dress suddenly looked stark and clinical, like a prison uniform. "The state of Delaware operates under a single-party consent law for audio recordings." Evelyn Rossi interjected, stepping smoothly into the silence. "My firm possesses the original audio file on a secure encrypted drive. Miss Sterling's verbal confession establishes undeniable premeditated intent to receive and conceal embezzled corporate funds." Evelyn placed her hands flat on the table, leaning slightly forward. "We are not extorting a better divorce settlement, Mr. Miller," Evelyn stated, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "We are simply informing your legal counsel that the marital assets you claimed were lost to operational debt are currently sitting in a beach house under your mistress's name. If you refuse to return those assets to my client, I will hand this entire black folder, including the audio confession, directly to the federal prosecutors at the Securities and Exchange Commission." Richard sank slowly back into his chair. The narcissistic bluster, the aggressive posturing, the threats of endless litigation, all of it had been systematically dismantled in less than 5 minutes by the daughter he had dismissed his entire life. He was trapped. If he fought the divorce settlement, Evelyn would trigger the federal investigation. He would lose his company, his wealth, and his freedom. He would spend the next decade in federal prison for tax fraud and corporate embezzlement. His false narrative was entirely destroyed. The power dynamic in the room had irreversibly inverted. Helen was no longer the destitute, discarded wife begging for crumbs. She was the victor holding the keys to his destruction. But the devastation was not contained solely to Richard and Vanessa. I had brought 3 folders into the room for a very specific reason. I turned my attention to the far end of the table. Bradley had not spoken a single word since I began my presentation. He sat frozen in his chair, his eyes glued to the open black folder in front of him. He was not looking at the property deed or the vendor payouts. He was staring at the final page of the document packet. I walked slowly down the length of the mahogany table until I stood directly across from my older brother, the golden child, the Ivy League investment banker who had told our mother to take the pitiful $50,000 and be grateful. "Did you review the final page in your folder?" Bradley, I asked softly. He slowly lifted his head. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. The pristine, arrogant Manhattan financier was gone. In his place sat a terrified young man whose entire future had just been incinerated by his own father. Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. The pristine, confident posture he had carried into the room had entirely evaporated. He looked down at the final page in the black folder, then looked back up at me. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The polished Manhattan investment banker was paralyzed by the stark reality of the documents resting under his fingertips. "What is it, Bradley?" I asked, my voice remaining cool and even. "Do you not recognize the document you signed?" The silence in the conference room stretched thin, brittle, and tight. Richard's lead attorney leaned over, attempting to see the paper in my brother's folder. Richard remained frozen in his chair, the gray pallor still clinging to his face, unaware of the specific detonation I had engineered for his prized son. I did not wait for Bradley to find his voice. I turned my attention to the aggressive divorce attorneys sitting across the mahogany table. As part of my investigation into the fraudulent vendor payouts, I reviewed the quarterly financial disclosures filed by Miller Freight Solutions. I explained delivering the facts with the clinical precision of a seasoned auditor. Because Miller Freight is a privately held corporation, exceeding a specific revenue threshold, state compliance regulations require the quarterly expense reports to be authorized by at least 2 active members of the advisory board. I gestured toward the open folder in front of my brother. The documents authorizing the $2.4 million transfer to Coastal Horizon Logistics bear 2 signatures, I stated. The first signature belongs to Richard Miller. I paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle heavily over the room. I looked directly at my father. "You have spent Bradley's entire life grooming him for success. You paid for his Ivy League education, you secured his position at a top-tier New York investment firm, and you placed him on your advisory board to build his corporate resume." I shifted my gaze back to Bradley. The second authorizing signature on the fraudulent vendor payout reports belongs to Bradley Miller. The devastating truth landed in the center of the conference room like a physical shockwave. Bradley was not merely a bystander to his father's financial crimes. By blindly signing the quarterly expense reports to maintain his prestigious position on the board, Bradley had legally verified the fraudulent transfers. He had authorized the embezzlement of corporate capital. Under federal law, he was a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. "You set me up," Bradley gasped. The words tore out of his throat, raw and panicked. He shoved the black folder away from him as if the paper itself were radioactive. He turned his head, his terrified gaze locking onto our father. "You told me those were standard operational expenses," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking, shedding all pretense of professional composure. "You sent the quarterly reports to my New York office and told me to sign off on the new shipping routes. You never told me the money was going to a shell company for your mistress." Richard finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He slammed his hands onto the table. "Keep your voice down, Bradley," he ordered, attempting to reassert his dominance over the room. "This is a misunderstanding. The documents can be amended. My accountants will fix the ledger discrepancies. You cannot amend a federal crime after the money has already been used to purchase a beach house," Evelyn Rossi interjected sharply. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. The funds were commingled. The paper trail is indelible. The moment those documents are handed over to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the investigation will not distinguish between the architect of the fraud and the negligent board member who authorized it. Evelyn directed her piercing stare at my brother. The SEC does not accept ignorance as a valid legal defense, Mr. Miller, Evelyn stated. If this file goes public, your career in Manhattan is over. Your Series 7 financial licenses will be permanently revoked. No investment bank on Wall Street will ever hire a broker implicated in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scandal. You will face the exact same federal charges as your father. The reality of his impending destruction crushed Bradley. The Ivy League degree, the bespoke suits, the towering glass penthouse in the city, all of it was vaporized in an instant. He had sacrificed his mother to protect his inheritance, only to discover that his father had unknowingly used him as a human shield for his financial crimes. "You destroyed my life!" Bradley screamed, rising from his chair. He pointed a trembling finger at Richard. The absolute loyalty of the narcissistic family dynamic shattered in real time. The golden child was turning violently against his creator. "You dragged me into your pathetic midlife crisis. I am not going to federal prison because you wanted to buy a villa in Dewey Beach. Calm down," Richard roared back, his own panic bleeding through his authoritative facade. "I am handling this. I have lawyers. We will bury the evidence." Bradley let out a hysterical, bitter laugh. "You cannot bury this, Dad. Look at them." He gestured wildly toward Evelyn and me. "They have the certified deeds. They have the audio recordings. They outsmarted you, you arrogant fool. You spent 20 years calling Charlotte the slow, local disappointment, and she just dismantled your entire empire in 10 minutes. The vicious truth of Bradley's words hung in the air. Richard had always underestimated me. He judged intelligence purely by the prestige of the university printed on the diploma. He failed to realize that true intelligence lies in the ability to observe the mechanisms of power quietly. He handed me the tools of his destruction the moment he assumed I was too simple to understand his corporate shell games. "I am securing my own legal counsel," Bradley announced, stepping away from the mahogany table. He began frantically stuffing his phone and his pen into his briefcase. "I am resigning from the advisory board effective immediately. I will testify against you if the feds bring charges. I will not take the fall for your theft. Bradley." "Sit down," Richard commanded, desperation tinged with fury, coloring his voice. "Do not walk out of this room. We are family. We have to present a united front." Bradley paused near the heavy double doors. He looked back at his father, his expression twisted with profound disgust. "We are not a family," Dad Bradley spat. "We are a liability matrix, and you just bankrupted the entire firm." He pushed through the doors and fled the conference room, leaving his father abandoned at the table. The implosion of their alliance was complete. Richard Miller was entirely isolated. His prized son had abandoned him, ready to turn state's evidence to save his own skin. His aggressive divorce attorneys sat frozen, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the criminal exposure sitting in the black folders. Vanessa was huddled in her chair, tears streaming down her flawless face. The arrogant woman who had marched onto the porch of the Wilmington estate, demanding antique clocks and mocking our cheap clothes, was gone. In her place sat a terrified accomplice who realized the luxury beach house she thought she owned was actually the very cage that would secure her prison sentence. I looked at my mother. Helen sat quietly in her chair. She had not spoken a single word during the entire confrontation. She had watched the man who discarded her and the son who betrayed her turn on each other like starved wolves. The fragile, broken woman who had wept over a plate of scrapple in a roadside diner was gone. She was witnessing the absolute destruction of her abusers, and she looked remarkably serene. I turned my attention back to my father. Richard sat slumped in his leather chair. The imposing corporate titan was reduced to a hollow, terrified shell. The crushing weight of his arrogance had finally collapsed the structural integrity of his entire life. He stared blankly at the black folder in front of him, processing the inescapable reality of his defeat. I reached out and closed the cover of the folder resting in front of me. The sharp snap of the heavy cardboard echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "The $50,000 settlement offer is no longer acceptable," I stated softly. Evelyn Rossi stepped forward, taking control of the final phase of the operation. She did not raise her voice. She utilized the calm, terrifying tone of an executioner delivering the final terms of surrender. "You have 48 hours," Richard Evelyn announced. "You will sign over 80% of your total assets to Helen Miller. This includes the unencumbered deed to the Wilmington estate, the remaining legitimate business shares in Miller Freight Solutions, and the immediate liquidation of the Dewey Beach property." She leaned down, placing her hands flat on the polished mahogany. "If those signed documents are not delivered to my office by noon on Saturday, the contents of these folders will be hand-delivered to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the federal prosecutor for the District of Delaware." Evelyn straightened her posture, signaling the end of the negotiation. "You brought a knife to a corporate compliance fight," Mr. Miller Evelyn said. "Now you will pay the toll." The demand for 80% of Richard's total assets hung in the heavy, sterile air of the conference room. Evelyn Rossi had delivered the terms with the chilling precision of a corporate execution. She was not merely stripping him of his wealth, she was demanding the systematic dismantling of his entire empire. The Wilmington estate, the remaining equity in his logistics firm, and the immediate liquidation of the Dewey Beach property. He was being ordered to surrender his identity. Richard's lead attorney finally found his voice, though it lacked the aggressive bluster he had carried into the room. "This is extortion, Ms. Rossi," the attorney stammered, his eyes darting nervously toward the black folders on the table. "You are compelling my client to sign a grossly inequitable divorce settlement under the threat of federal prosecution. No judge in Delaware will uphold an agreement signed under this level of duress." Evelyn turned her attention to the lawyer. Her expression was a mask of cold, professional disdain. "Extortion implies I am demanding something to which my client is not legally entitled," Evelyn replied smoothly. "However, Delaware is an equitable distribution state. When one spouse actively commits fraud to dissipate marital assets, the court is obligated to penalize the offending party by awarding a disproportionate share of the remaining estate to the victimized spouse." She took a slow, deliberate step toward the opposing legal team. "Furthermore, I am not threatening criminal prosecution. I am merely stating that as officers of the court, we possess a professional obligation to report suspected federal financial crimes to the appropriate regulatory bodies. If Mr. Miller voluntarily liquidates the fraudulent LLC and returns the misappropriated funds to the marital estate via this settlement, the financial injury to my client is resolved, negating our need to initiate a civil discovery process that would inadvertently expose his criminal liabilities to the authorities." Evelyn leaned forward, placing her manicured hands flat on the mahogany surface. "You are a seasoned attorney. Do not play naive. You know exactly how this game works. Advise your client to sign the settlement or start preparing his federal criminal defense strategy. I assure you, the retaining fees for a white-collar defense firm will cost him far more than the 20% of assets I am generously allowing him to keep." The lawyer closed his mouth. He looked at Richard, the silent communication between them clear. Evelyn was right. The risk of federal prison far outweighed the pain of a catastrophic divorce settlement. They had no counterplay. The trap was ironclad. Vanessa, however, was not bound by the quiet, calculated resignation of the legal professionals. The realization that she was about to lose the luxury beach house she thought she owned finally broke through her shock. The designer lifestyle she had traded her youth to secure was evaporating before her eyes. She pushed her chair back, the harsh scraping sound echoing in the silent room. She stood up, her flawless face contorted with panic and desperate self-preservation. "You cannot take the Dewey Beach house," Vanessa shrilled, pointing a trembling finger at Evelyn. "The deed is in my name. The LLC belongs to me. It is my private property. You have no legal right to liquidate it for her divorce settlement." I turned my head and looked directly at my father's mistress. "The LLC was funded with embezzled corporate capital," I explained calmly, maintaining my clinical tone. "Assets purchased with stolen funds are subject to immediate seizure and forfeiture. The moment Evelyn notifies the SEC, federal agents will lock down the property. You will lose the house anyway, Vanessa. The only difference is whether you lose it quietly through this settlement or whether you lose it while wearing handcuffs during a federal raid." Vanessa's eyes widened in sheer terror. The reality of her profound legal exposure crashed over her. She looked at the black folder, then looked at Richard, her survival instincts kicking into overdrive. The loyalty that supposedly bound their new family together disintegrated instantly. "I did not know the money was stolen," Vanessa cried out, taking a frantic step away from Richard, physically distancing herself from the sinking ship. "He told me it was a legitimate corporate dividend. He lied to me. I thought he was a successful CEO. I had no idea he was a criminal hiding money from his wife." Richard snapped his head toward her, his face twisting with sudden raw fury. "Do not lie, Vanessa. You knew exactly what we were doing. You laughed about it on the porch when you told Charlotte you owned the holding company. You wanted the beach house and you did not care how I secured the funds. I am a victim in this." Vanessa shrieked, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. She turned her desperate gaze toward Evelyn and me. "I will sign whatever documents you need. I will transfer the deed back to the marital estate. Just keep my name out of the federal investigation. Please. I am too young to go to prison for his mistakes." The speed of her betrayal was breathtaking. In less than 60 seconds, the smug, arrogant woman who had marched onto the Wilmington estate to claim our family heirlooms had reduced herself to a weeping, terrified accomplice begging for mercy. She was actively offering to serve Richard on a silver platter to save her own skin. Richard stared at her, the profound humiliation of her rapid defection settling heavily over his features. He had sacrificed his marriage of 28 years, alienated his daughter, and unknowingly implicated his prized son in federal fraud, all to build a new life with a woman who abandoned him the moment the money vanished. He was entirely alone. The isolation was absolute. Richard slowly turned his head back toward me. The arrogant, untouchable CEO facade was completely gone. The man sitting across from me looked older, smaller, and desperately broken. Charlotte Richard pleaded. His voice cracked the sound unfamiliar and pathetic. "Please, you have made your point. You proved you are smarter than I thought. But you cannot do this. You cannot take the company. I built Miller Freight Solutions from the ground up. It is my legacy. It is the only thing I have left." I did not respond. I simply watched him perform. "We are blood. Charlotte," he continued, leaning forward across the table, his eyes pleading for a connection he had spent my entire life denying. "You are my daughter. You cannot destroy your own father. Helen is angry, I understand that. But you have the power to stop this. Talk to her. Convince her to accept a reasonable 50-50 split. I will give you a position on the advisory board. I will pay off your student loans. Just do not take the company." He was attempting to leverage a familial bond that had never existed. He was trying to buy my loyalty with the exact same corporate positions and financial promises he had used to control Bradley. He truly believed everything and everyone possessed a price tag. I looked at the man who had mocked my academic choices at every holiday dinner. I looked at the man who had stood on my graduation stage and publicly humiliated my mother to feed his own ego. I placed my hands flat on the table and leaned slightly forward, mirroring Evelyn's earlier posture. "You do not get to invoke our bloodline to save your empire, Dad," I stated softly. My voice carried the chilling, immovable weight of absolute finality. "You spent 22 years treating me like a local disappointment because I did not possess an Ivy League degree. You treated Mom like an unpaid employee you could terminate the moment you found a younger replacement. You drained our bank accounts and left us in a roadside motel because you thought we were too weak to survive without you." I paused, letting the silence amplify the devastating truth of my words. "You stood on that stadium stage 10 days ago, and you introduced your mistress to 2,000 people. You told the crowd she was our new family. You made your choice publicly, Richard. You discarded us." I reached out and placed my hand over the black folder containing the evidence of his destruction. "I am not destroying my father," I concluded, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. "I am just finalizing the paperwork for the choice you already made." Richard closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping in total crushing defeat. The fight was over. He possessed no remaining leverage, no loyal allies, and no escape routes. Evelyn Rossi straightened her suit jacket efficiently, signaling the end of the mediation session. My paralegal will deliver the revised settlement documents to your office by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Evelyn informed the opposing attorneys. Mr. Miller will sign them immediately. He will initiate the transfer of the Wilmington deed and the 80% asset allocation by close of business on Friday. If there is a single delay, a single hesitation, or a single missing dollar, I will trigger the federal investigation. Evelyn turned and offered her arm to Helen. Shall we go, Helen? I believe our business here is concluded. Helen stood up. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at Vanessa. She carried herself with the quiet, dignified grace of a woman who had just reclaimed her life from the ashes of a 30-year nightmare. I gathered my tote bag and followed my mother and my mentor out of the conference room. We walked down the soundproofed corridor and stepped into the elevator. The door slid shut, cutting off the sight of my father sitting paralyzed in the ruins of his own arrogance. The divorce was settled with maximum unforgiving justice. The immediate financial and legal war was won, but the psychological aftermath of dismantling a narcissistic family structure is rarely a clean break. The abusers were neutralized, but the collateral damage they caused would echo through the coming months. We had secured our survival, but we still had to build a new reality from the wreckage. 4 months passed. The transition from late spring into early autumn brought a crisp, cooling edge to the humid Delaware air. The sprawling coastal marshes began their slow shift from vibrant green to a muted, dormant gold. The changing seasons mirrored the profound transformation that had reshaped the landscape of our lives. The revised settlement documents had been signed without a single word of protest. Richard Miller formally surrendered 80% of his total assets, including the unencumbered deed to the Wilmington estate and the vast majority of his remaining legitimate equity in Miller Freight Solutions. He avoided federal prison, but the cost was the total annihilation of the empire he had spent 3 decades building. The corporate world of Wilmington is small, insular, and notoriously unforgiving of weakness. Richard attempted to quietly restructure his logistics firm, operating out of a leased office space in a declining industrial park. He tried to maintain the facade of a powerful CEO, but the reality of his diminished status seeped into the local business ecosystem. Rumors of his catastrophic divorce settlement and the sudden liquidation of his auxiliary assets spread through the tight-knit country club circles and corporate boardrooms. Vendors demanded shorter payment terms. Major clients, sensing instability, quietly transitioned their shipping contracts to more reliable competitors. His reputation, the only currency he truly valued, evaporated. Vanessa's departure followed shortly after. The moment she realized the luxury beach house was gone and the limitless flow of corporate cash had dried up, her devotion vanished. She did not linger to support the man she had proudly claimed as her future husband on my graduation stage. She quietly packed her designer bags and moved to Miami, allegedly attaching herself to a prominent real estate developer who possessed the untethered capital Richard had lost. She discarded him with the exact same ruthless efficiency he had used to discard my mother. Helen moved back into the Wilmington estate. She did not simply occupy the space, she reclaimed it. She stripped away the cold, minimalist decor Richard had favored and filled the expansive rooms with warmth and light. She reconnected with the local charity boards and the community groups she had been forced to abandon during her marriage. The fragile, broken woman who had wept in a roadside diner was gone, replaced by a confident, financially independent matriarch who answered to no one. I remained at Rossi and Associates. Evelyn Rossi did not treat me as an entry-level analyst anymore. I had proven my capacity to navigate high-stakes corporate warfare with clinical precision. She rapidly promoted me, transitioning my role from basic registry compliance to specialized internal investigations. I spent my days identifying the exact type of financial vulnerabilities Richard had attempted to exploit. I was thriving in the quiet, powerful shadows of the Delaware corporate haven. The war was seemingly won, the abusers neutralized, and the boundaries firmly established. Or so I believed. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early November, the secure, predictable rhythm of my new life was abruptly interrupted. I was sitting in my glass-walled office reviewing a dense audit report when the firm's receptionist buzzed my internal line. The digital display on my desk phone blinked. I pressed the speaker button. "Yes, Sarah," I answered without looking up from my monitor. "Ms. Miller," the receptionist said, her tone carrying a note of polite hesitation. "There is a gentleman in the lobby asking to see you. He does not have an appointment, but he claims it is an urgent family matter. He said his name is Bradley Miller." My fingers froze over the keyboard. The rhythmic tapping ceased. Bradley. I had not seen or spoken to my older brother since he fled the mahogany conference room 4 months ago, terrified by the impending threat of an SEC investigation. He had vanished back to Manhattan, desperately attempting to distance himself from the toxic fallout of our father's fraud. "Send him back," I instructed smoothly, masking the sudden sharp spike of adrenaline in my chest. A few moments later, my office door swung open. Bradley stepped inside. The man standing before me was a ghost of the arrogant, pristine investment banker I remembered. The bespoke tailored suit he wore looked slightly rumpled, lacking its usual crisp precision. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened into permanent bruises of exhaustion. He looked incredibly young, profoundly lost, and deeply desperate. He closed the door behind him and stood awkwardly near the visitor chairs. He did not possess the confident swagger he usually carried into a room. "Charlotte," he began, his voice tight and strained. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I should have called first, but I needed to speak with you in person." I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair. I did not offer him a seat. "What do you want, Bradley?" He shifted his weight uncomfortably, the silence stretching between us. "Things have been incredibly difficult in New York," he finally admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "The rumors regarding Dad's sudden financial collapse reached the senior partners at my firm. They started asking questions about my involvement on the advisory board of Miller Freight Solutions. They ran an internal compliance review. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, ruining the perfection. They deemed me a reputational risk. He confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. They forced me to resign last week. I lost my position. I lost my equity track. My career in Manhattan is effectively over. Nobody on Wall Street will touch a broker with a suspected compliance scandal attached to their family name. The irony was breathtaking. Bradley had sacrificed his mother to protect his elite career, only to lose that career because he had blindly trusted the father who manipulated him. He was experiencing the exact same sudden, terrifying destitution he had told Helen to accept with gratitude. "I am sorry to hear you lost your job," I said, my tone remaining entirely neutral. "But that does not explain why you are standing in my office." Bradley finally looked up, meeting my eyes with a desperate, pleading expression. "I have nowhere else to go, Charlotte. I cannot go to Dad. He is operating out of a strip mall and barely making payroll. I cannot go to Mom. She will not return my phone calls." He took a hesitant step closer to my desk. "You have influence here," he said, gesturing around my spacious, well-appointed office. "Evelyn Rossi is a major player in the Wilmington corporate sector. She respects you. You proved you understand compliance better than anyone. I need a job, Charlotte. An analyst role, a consulting position, anything. I am smart. I know the markets. I can be an asset to this firm. Please, I need you to help me." My brother, the golden child who had mocked my decision to stay in state and earn a local degree, was now begging me for an entry-level position at a Delaware registry firm. The reversal of our roles was absolute. He was relying on the assumption that the fundamental bonds of family would override the devastating betrayal he had committed. He believed that deep down, I was still the quiet, compliant sister who would ultimately submit to the needs of the favored son. I looked at him for a long, heavy moment. I let the silence fill the room, allowing the weight of his desperate plea to settle between us. I reached forward and closed the audit file on my desk. "No," I stated. The single word was quiet, definitive, and devoid of any hesitation. Bradley blinked, visibly startled by the immediate rejection. "Charlotte." "Please," he stammered, panic edging into his voice. "I am your brother. I made a mistake. I trusted Dad and he lied to me. I was a victim of his manipulation too. You cannot just turn your back on me when I have nothing." I stood up from my desk. I did not raise my voice, but the cold, clinical authority in my tone filled the entire office. "You were not a victim, Bradley," I corrected him sharply. "You were a willing participant. When Mom was sitting in that diner staring at a plate of untouched scrapple because she believed she was going to be homeless, I called you for help. You told me she chose the wrong side. You told me to figure it out myself." I walked around the desk, stopping a few feet away from him. "When Dad ambushed her with that pitiful $50,000 settlement, you sat in that conference room and told her to take the deal and be grateful," I continued. My gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "You watched him try to financially execute the woman who raised you, and you supported him because you wanted to protect your inheritance. You only turned on him when you realized his crimes threatened your own career." "Charlotte." I was scared, he pleaded, tears welling in his eyes. I panicked. "I do not care if you panicked," I replied coldly. "Character is defined by how you act when you are terrified. You chose to protect your money over your mother's survival. That is not a mistake. That is who you are." I walked past him and opened the glass door to my office. "Rossi and Associates handles the most sensitive corporate compliance data in the state," I said, standing by the open door. "We require employees who possess unshakable integrity. You signed falsified financial reports because you were too arrogant to read the documents, and you sold out your own family for a payout that never materialized." I gestured toward the reception area. "You are a massive liability, Bradley," I concluded, "and my office does not hire liabilities. Leave. Do not come back here and do not attempt to contact Mom. We are done." Bradley stared at me, the profound, inescapable reality of his isolation finally crashing over him. He had burned every bridge, betrayed every ally, and destroyed his own safety net. He opened his mouth to argue, but the cold, immovable finality in my posture silenced him. He slowly turned and walked out of my office, his head bowed in total defeat. He trudged down the pristine, carpeted corridor, a broken man carrying the immense weight of his own terrible choices. I watched him disappear into the elevator. I closed my office door, the quiet click sealing the perimeter of my life. The lingering threat of the toxic family dynamic was permanently neutralized. The narcissist was ruined, the mistress had fled, and the golden child was exiled. The abusers would not return because I had established ironclad boundaries that they lacked the strength to breach. The past was finally decisively severed. Now the only thing remaining was to shape the future I had fought so fiercely to secure. The transition from winter into early summer brought a profound, vibrant warmth back to the state of Delaware. The flat, sprawling coastal marshes along the Delmarva Peninsula turned a brilliant, verdant green. The waters of the Delaware Bay shimmered under the clear skies, and the oppressive, suffocating tension that had gripped my life for the past year finally dissolved into the humid, salty air. We did not merely survive the corporate warfare inflicted upon us. We emerged from the wreckage and built an entirely new reality. The grand brick facade of the Wilmington estate no longer felt like a sterile, intimidating museum dedicated to a narcissistic executive. Helen had systematically purged every trace of Richard from the property. She tore down the heavy, dark drapes he had favored and replaced them with sheer fabrics that allowed the morning sunlight to flood across the hardwood floors. She filled the expansive rooms with color life and the undeniable presence of her own independent identity. Standing proudly in the main foyer was the antique Dutch colonial grandfather clock. It was the exact family heirloom Vanessa had foolishly attempted to steal on the front porch during her brief, arrogant reign. Its rhythmic ticking echoed through the bright hallways, a constant soothing heartbeat, reminding us of the heritage and resilience we had fought so fiercely to protect. Helen was thriving. The brittle, terrified woman who had wept over a cheap plate of scrapple in a roadside diner was a distant memory. She utilized the vast settlement funds to secure her future investing in local municipal bonds and supporting regional charitable trusts. She joined the State Historical Society, dedicating her time to preserving the Quaker and Dutch colonial architecture that defined our small, tight-knit communities. She was the architect of her own vibrant existence, stepping out of the long, dark shadow of a man who had never recognized her true worth. My own trajectory had shifted from survival to a focused professional ascent. 2 weeks prior to the onset of summer, Evelyn Rossi called me into her pristine corner office. She did not hand me a stack of basic registry filings. She handed me a revised employment contract. I was officially promoted from an entry-level analyst to a full compliance investigator. Evelyn granted me my own office, a dedicated support staff, and a portfolio of high-risk corporate clients. My daily responsibilities now involve tracing complex financial fraud across state lines, utilizing the exact forensic techniques I had developed while dismantling my father's logistics empire. The promotion was not an act of charity. It was a dividend earned through fire. Evelyn recognized that my unique ability to decipher the hidden architecture of shell companies was an invaluable asset to her firm. We had forged a bond rooted in mutual respect, navigating the treacherous waters of Delaware corporate law side by side. To celebrate the milestone, Helen hosted a private dinner on the spacious back patio of the Wilmington estate. The evening air was thick with the scent of blooming hydrangeas and the pungent, spicy aroma of Old Bay seasoning. Strings of warm yellow lights draped across the wooden pergola, casting a soft golden glow over a long table covered in layers of old newspaper. In the center of the table sat a massive steaming pot of freshly caught Delaware blue crabs. Evelyn Rossi sat across from me. The formidable managing partner had traded her sharp, intimidating charcoal blazer for a simple, relaxed linen blouse. She held a wooden mallet in her hand, laughing a rich, uninhibited laugh as she struggled to crack a stubborn crab claw. The physical act of eating blue crabs is a communal, messy, and deeply rewarding process. It requires patience, precise leverage, and a willingness to dig past the hard exterior to secure the sweet meat hidden inside. It felt perfectly symbolic of the journey the three of us had undertaken together. We used our wooden mallets to shatter the bright red shells. We drank cold iced tea infused with fresh mint, plucked directly from Helen's newly cultivated garden. We shared stories that had nothing to do with corporate ledgers, hostile divorce settlements, or treacherous family members. We talked about the upcoming local festivals, laughing over the absurd, quirky traditions of the regional Punkin' Chunkin' contest. We talked about the future with a profound sense of optimism. Looking around that patio, listening to the genuine laughter of my mother and my mentor, I experienced a moment of total, unshakable clarity. People outside our circle who learned of the corporate shakeup often assumed I harbored a deep, vindictive desire for payback. They expected me to gloat over the ruins of my father's empty industrial park office, or to take pleasure in the sudden, humiliating downfall of my brother's Manhattan investment banking career. But revenge is a corrosive poison that requires you to keep drinking it. I did not seek revenge against Richard, Vanessa, or Bradley. I simply sought the truth. I gathered the public property deeds, the fraudulent financial ledgers, and the audio recordings. I held up a clear, undeniable mirror to a family structure built entirely on deception. The sheer force of their own lies shattered their reflection. Truth does not require any malice. Truth only requires the courage to bring the hidden ledgers out of the dark and into the light. Looking back at the psychological machinery of my former family, I understand the precise mechanics of what occurred. There is a clinical concept known as narcissistic projection. A person who lacks a stable, authentic internal identity will take their own deepest insecurities and project them onto a designated scapegoat. Richard was terrified of his own intellectual inadequacy. He knew he had built his logistics wealth on a foundation of smoke mirrors and his wife's unpaid labor. He looked at his daughter, the quiet girl who chose to study the intricate rules of corporate compliance, and he called her a failure. He projected his own limitations onto me. He assigned me a conditional worth, demanding I perform according to his shallow metrics of prestige to earn his basic human respect. He was determined to convince me that I was small, but I realized that accepting his definition of my worth was the only thing keeping me trapped. The moment I stopped seeking the approval of a man incapable of giving it his power over me, evaporated. I used the very traits he mocked: my quiet observation, my local education, my methodical patience to dismantle the cage he had built around my mother and me. We finished our dinner under the glow of the patio lights, the discarded red crab shells piled high on the newspaper, a testament to a feast shared among equals. Evelyn raised her glass of iced tea, offering a silent, smiling toast to the life we had secured. Helen raised her glass in return, her eyes bright with unshed, joyful tears. I leaned back in my patio chair, listening to the distant rhythmic chirping of the cicadas in the coastal marshlands just beyond the edge of the property line. I survived the ultimate betrayal from the people who were biologically obligated to protect me. I learned that you do not need to scream to win a war. You just have to build a truth so undeniable that their lies simply shatter against it. He called me a local girl like it was an insult. But knowing the ground you stand on is exactly how you build an empire. If you have ever had to outsmart the people who were supposed to protect you, you know blood does not make family. Respect does. Share your story in the comments, hit subscribe, and remember, never let anyone tell you you are not enough. We often stand in the doorways of our own homes, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chatter of a television, the footsteps of our children on the stairs, and ask ourselves what we are actually building. We pour our energy into the mortgage, the college funds, the endless schedules of soccer practices, and SAT preparations. We chase a specific version of the American dream, one paved with pristine lawns and impressive resumes. But the story of Charlotte and Richard Miller serves as a profound mirror, reflecting a quieter, more urgent question. Are we raising human beings, or are we curating a public exhibit? From the perspective of a spiritual observer, the collapse of the Miller family is not merely a tale of corporate espionage or a satisfying courtroom drama. It is a modern parable about the sickness that can take root within the traditional family structure when we worship the ego chase, the illusion of materialism, and substitute genuine affection with conditional love. When we examine the current state of modern society, we see a culture hyper-focused on external validation. We are taught to measure our parenting success by the accumulation of status. We want the Ivy League degree for our children, the luxury estate, the flawless public image we can project to our neighbors. But through a spiritual lens, Charlotte's journey offers an essential guide for self-improvement wisdom and morality in how we guide the next generation. The first and most critical lesson lies in the danger of conditional love. In the Miller household, the father viewed his family not as sacred souls entrusted to his care, but as extensions of his own ego. His son, the golden child, received affection only because he reflected the father's desire for prestige. Charlotte was discarded because her quiet nature and local ambitions did not fit his superficial mold. A child is not a trophy, a billboard, or a second chance to achieve your own unfulfilled ambitions. When parental love becomes conditional, doled out only for high-grade social status or compliance with a rigid image, it fractures the child's spirit. It breeds a home where anxiety replaces trust. True family responsibility requires us to love our children for their authentic essence. We must do the difficult work of healing our own internal insecurities so we do not project them onto our offspring. Loving a child means seeing them clearly, accepting them, and nurturing their unique path, even if it diverges from the one we imagined. This brings us to the second vital lesson, cultivating inner substance over outer optics. Richard's downfall was rooted in his obsession with appearances. He constructed a life of shell corporations and hollow relationships to hide his moral bankruptcy. Society today frequently pressures parents to prioritize how our lives look on the outside rather than how they feel on the inside. We are encouraged to build facades. We must teach our children the value of inner substance. A prestigious degree or a heavy bank account means very little if the soul is starved of integrity. We cultivate morality by modeling it. We must show our children that honesty, fairness, and taking responsibility for one's actions are the true markers of a successful human being. When we build our lives on the solid rock of truth, rather than the shifting sands of public opinion, we render our families unshakable. A home built on honesty can weather any storm. A home built on deceit will eventually collapse under its own weight. Furthermore, Charlotte's victory teaches us the profound power of stillness. She did not win her battle by screaming, seeking petty vengeance, or matching her father's toxic aggression. She won through mindfulness, quiet observation, and patience. She saw the reality of the situation and allowed the truth to do the heavy lifting. In a world that is loud, reactive, and easily outraged, emotional awareness is a crucial skill to pass down. Wisdom does not shout. Ego shouts. We must encourage our children to pause, observe, and think critically before they react. Teach them that true resilience is not about fighting fire with fire, but about remaining grounded in one's own truth. When we act from a place of calm clarity rather than emotional volatility, we align ourselves with a higher wisdom that naturally resolves conflict. We give our children the tools to navigate a chaotic world without losing their center. Finally, this story vividly illustrates the universal law of cause and effect. Richard's deceit, arrogance, and lack of empathy were the exact instruments of his own destruction. He was not undone by his daughter. He was undone by his own karma. As parents, we are responsible for instilling a deep understanding of moral consequence. Every action, word, and intention ripples outward. If we plant seeds of deception and cruelty, we will inevitably harvest isolation. Conversely, if we plant seeds of integrity, diligence, and respect, we will harvest a life of peace and authentic connection. Teach your children that no one escapes the consequences of their own character. The universe always balances the ledger. If you find value in exploring the deeper truths hidden within these dramatic family dynamics, and if you want to hear more narratives that challenge the way we think about justice, boundaries, and personal growth, take a moment to subscribe to the channel Savage Revenge Stories. We share tales that unmask the illusions we live by and celebrate the quiet strength of those who stand in their truth. To the parents reflecting on this today, the greatest inheritance you will ever leave your children is not a trust fund, a sprawling estate, or a prestigious surname. The greatest inheritance is the spiritual and moral foundation you lay within them. Turn inward. Do the difficult work of dismantling your own ego. Stop comparing your family to the impossible curated standards of modern society. Build a home where truth is spoken without fear, where mistakes are met with guidance rather than shame, and where respect is the daily currency. When the house is quiet and the lights are turned off, look at the life you are building. Ask yourself what legacy you are truly leaving behind in the minds of your children. Are you giving them a script to perform, or are you giving them the roots they need to grow? The answer to that question might be the only thing that truly matters in the end.